She was very close to her family. She was a family girl.
She was only 22, and there's nothing that will ever fill that hole for them.
I just had about 9 gunshots back behind my building.
He winds up locating a silver Lexus with gunshot damage to the driver's side of the vehicle.
The vehicle was locked. There was a black female in the driver's side seat, slumped over.
I saw somebody take off running.
She was always going to be his girl. That means his property.
When we got into the cell phone, there was a saved video.
She was able to speak from the grave.
He wanted to get revenge, and he didn't want her to be happy.
May 22nd, 2021. It's just after 10 p.m. in Walterboro, South Carolina. An off-duty Walterboro police officer is relaxing at home.
Sergeant Ross Hance has lived at the Forest Point Apartments for a number of years, and he was living there at the time.
At 10:14 p.m., he hears a familiar but alarming sound.
He, at that point, hears multiple gunshots. He advises here. He hears approximately 9 gunshots come from the parking lot area.
He called into dispatch and reported those shots.
Hey, I just had about 9 gunshots back behind my building in Forest Point.
All right, I'll get somebody out there.
I'm stepping outside right now to try to find out what's going on.
All right.
He proceeds to go outside to check the parking lot, trying to find a crime scene.
As the off-duty officer went to look around his cruiser, he noticed that it was a silver Lexus parked next to his car.
He winds up locating a silver Lexus with multiple signs of gunshot damage to the driver's side of the vehicle.
He saw a silver car with the windows busted out, and that's when he saw the victim.
The vehicle was locked. There was a black female in the driver's side seat, slumped over, appeared to be unresponsive.
More officers arrive on the scene.
In order to gain access to the vehicle, the responding officers had to use what's called a lockout kit.
As they attempt to reach the victim, calls continue to come in to 911.
911, where's your emergency?
We're at Forest Point. I think somebody already called because cops are already out here.
Yes, ma'am. Did you hear anything or see anything?
I didn't see anything. We just heard the gunshot. I can let you talk to my neighbor, and she can tell you what she saw maybe. Hold on 1 second. She's coming up the stairs. She was scared because she saw something. Hello?
Did you see anybody?
I saw somebody take off running. That's what I saw.
The officers gain access to the vehicle.
The bullets clearly came from the driver's side door, so they came from the passenger side to try to render aid.
She had a lot of wounds on her from the glass that had kind of embedded in her skin and cut her when it shattered.
She had several gunshots. She was deceased. They searched the car, searched her persons, and they found her ID, which identified her as 22-year-old Danisha Holloway.
When they identified her as Denasia Holloway, Officer Hance also knew that she was also a resident within the apartment complex.
They were just trying to figure out why someone would do this in, her point of residence. This is her parking lot to her apartment. Who thought that they could do this and get away with it?
Denasia Alexis Holloway was born on January 21st, 1999. She grew up alongside 2 brothers and a family of 5.
She was the only daughter in her family. Her family really loved her and idolized her as being that only daughter.
Denasia went to R.B. Stahl High School in North Charleston, where she excelled at track and also participated in ROTC. According to her family, Denasia was an incredible track star. In her senior year, they said she broke the record for the 100-meter dash, which is absolutely amazing. She ran it in 13.5 seconds in April 1st, 2017. That's just incredible. Denasia enrolled in Coastal Carolina University in 2019, and she majored in biology, scheduled to graduate in the class of 2023.
By January 2020, Denasia was dating Justin Carroll.
Justin was 21 at the time they met. Denasia was 22. They were really young, and, anyone being in love in your early 20s is going to be pretty much a honeymoon phase.
In October, the couple moved in together. They shared an apartment in the Forest Point complex, along with the Denasia's fur babies.
She was a humble, sweet person that really loved animals and loved to give her time to different, organizations in the area, but also really spend time with her family and appreciated that element of her life.
In early 2021, Denasia and Justin ended their relationship, and he moved out. Denasia planned to leave her apartment in Walterboro.
She had just graduated and was coming home. She was trying to move back to Somerville to be with her family, which is where they currently lived.
Denasia also took a new job, working for a major shipping company, and started planning her future.
One night, Denasia started getting nonstop text messages from Justin. So the way she handled it, she sent him a picture of her and her friend to kind of get him to see, listen, I've moved on.
She was getting out into the world again and starting to travel and seeing this new guy. Things were looking up. She was about to move out of those apartments and was looking forward to moving back home with her parents for a little while.
But on the evening of May 22nd, 2021, Denasia is dead inside her car in the parking lot of her apartment building. Homicide detectives arrive on the scene.
Well, they began to secure the crime scene to make sure none of the evidence was tampered with, and also to locate any kind of spent casings in the area.
They found 6 .40 caliber shell casings. And what's important about that is shell casings can be used for identification of the suspect, because if he loaded the gun, his prints may be on the shell casing themselves. So that is very valuable evidence.
The coroner pronounced her dead. At that point, she was removed from the vehicle. A search of the vehicle and the vehicle's processed.
A couple DNA swabs were taken from the vehicle that night. When we take DNA swabs, we don't know right away that anything is actually on the swab. You have to send that off for testing. But the palm print indicated that someone was on the outside of the vehicle touching it in some form. When Denasia was discovered, her car door was shut.
Investigators thoroughly searched the inside of Denasia's vehicle for more evidence.
Nothing was taken. Her purse was still there. Her cell phone was there. So it wasn't a robbery.
What we do when we encounter a phone for a victim, or any case that we seize a phone, our normal process is to log it into evidence, and we do have to obtain a search warrant to go any further as far as looking into the phone.
Her phone could have any kind of messages, any kind of recordings on it. Who knows what she could have on her phone. From there, they started to canvass the area, which means that they're knocking on doors, seeing who heard what, who's seen anything. Officers noticed several residents standing on the balcony, and so they knocked on the door, asked if they seen anything, and some of them said they seen a male running from the scene in very dark clothing, but it was so dark, it was hard to identify his face. And they said, yes, we heard the gunshots. We ran outside. We saw a possible white male running with a hood on and with a mask covered half of his face, so we couldn't really see who he was, but we did see him run from the scene.
Is the masked man Denasia's attacker?
In crimes of any nature, especially violent crimes like this one, investigators quickly will try and turn to security camera footage. And that can be, from anywhere that had an angle of where this crime occurred.
So at that point, they didn't know what was going on. But the apartment complex has surveillance cameras. And so what they did was contact the apartment complex manager, who let them in to review that camera footage. You could see some movement beside her car, and then you see the stocky white male running away.
After 22-year-old Denasia Holloway is shot to death in front of her apartment building, police in Walterboro, South Carolina obtained surveillance footage from management.
They made contact with the apartment complex so they could review the video evidence, because there was multiple cameras at the scene.
On one video, investigators see Denasia's vehicle pull into the apartment complex at 10:05 p.m., minutes before the first 911 call.
They observed another vehicle following behind Miss Holloway pull off and park out of sight of the cameras.
So as they look through the video, they can see that her Lexus pull in, backs in to the space next to the patrol car. Her lights are still on.
After parking what appeared to be a pickup truck in an out-of-the-way area, they saw this white male walk towards the location where she was parked, but kind of linger around behind the building.
Within minutes, a white male subject is seen approaching the apartment complex main office, then approaching the 200 building. He's later seen walking away from the 200 building, lighting a cigarette, and then approaching Miss Holloway's vehicle.
He goes to the car, and you can clearly see that he's aggressive, talking to her, leaning over to the window. You know something's going on, but he's really blocking the view by the camera, right with his body. You can't really see what's going on.
The next thing you see is the unidentified male running away back toward the front parking area.
Even though they had this security camera footage in the nighttime, in the dark, it's still very hard to pick up any clues. They can see a figure, but they can't really make out any identifying, features of this individual.
They also can't get a clear shot of the truck. Across the street, they find more cameras.
There's a nearby church which gives us a better look at the vehicle, and as far as potential make and model, you can tell it's a later model vehicle, but we didn't have a good look at the plate.
Investigators reach out to Denasia's family to deliver the heartbreaking news.
You're never prepared for it, to see people grieving, but it's something you have to do. You approach the family and you tell them what happened was sincere, but as an investigator, you want to make sure you let their family know that you're going to solve the case and bring justice for their family members.
When the family first found out about Denasia's death, instantly they are shocked. They are beside themselves and just don't even know how to handle this news.
The coroner is the one that actually gives the notification to the family. I and any other officers involved, we just keep working the case. That leaves me in a position to just do nothing but find the suspect.
Investigators get details about Denasia's death from the autopsy.
She had been shot at least 4 times, according to the pathologist report. The fatal one being the shot to her neck, which killed her almost instantly.
A theory about the killing takes shape.
It was a specific target car with none of the other cars, with nothing taken. It was shot 4 times, and it just seemed like it was just personal. It didn't seem random at all.
She did not call 911 right away, didn't try to drive away at that point. It was something personal. She knew the individual. You have to look at a possible past relationship, a friendship gone bad, a family member. So at that point, they knew that they would have to dive into her history.
Investigators run her name through the system. They learned that on January 7th, 2021, police were called to Denasia's apartment over a domestic dispute between Denasia and her then boyfriend, Justin Carroll.
Ms. Holloway refused to give Justin her phone. He thought she was cheating. She wouldn't unlock it. He got angry. She refused to open her phone. So then he went to the back bedroom and pulled out the gun out of the dresser drawer and put it to her face.
Denasia called her mom during that incident, and her mother called the police to report this. Her mother was taking it very seriously.
By the time the police arrived, Justin was no longer there. Justin fled, taking the gun with him.
Police finally caught with him. He was charged with domestic violence and had an order of protection put on him. Order of protection is very specific of what it does. What it does, it protects the victim from being contacted by the suspect. So at that time, he could not text her, he could not call her, leave any kind of message to a friend or family. He had no contact at all. It was what the order says.
Well, after the restraining order, I believe she distanced herself a good bit from him. She stayed within the apartment complex. He had moved out at that point.
Justin went back to his grandparents and lived with them for a while, so they had totally split up and was separated. Ms. Holloway finally went back and lived by herself later on.
Police run a background check on Justin Carroll. The incident with Denasia wasn't his first brush with the law.
In 2016, Justin had 5 counts of attempted murder against him, so he's used to doing violent things.
Those charges were eventually reduced.
He had been convicted of assault and battery in the first degree, and he was forbidden from carrying a firearm.
Justin was sentenced to 8 years of probation, but his probation was revoked in March 2018 when he was found in possession of a gun and a controlled substance. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but released on probation in 2020, shortly before he and Denasia met. Justin's history and violence against Denasia makes him suspect number 1.
He became a person of interest at this time because he has the means and the motives to maybe do this.
Investigators pulled Justin's DMV records.
It gives us a DMV photo along with his height and weight.
They compared it to the video surveillance and his DMV photo, which listed him as 5'6", 230 pounds, and saw that there was a large resemblance there.
That put Mr. Carroll kind of at our top of our list of people we really want to talk to. At this point, we had a potential murder suspect.
Investigators compared Justin Carroll's driver's license photo to surveillance footage taken from the scene where his ex-girlfriend, Denasia Holloway, was gunned down.
That kind of helped close the circle on him a little bit more. His height and weight and his DMV photo really kind of, it was good enough for us to say we're kind of pointed in the right direction.
Detectives also learn what kind of vehicle he drives.
That vehicle's registered to family members at an address in a different part of the city. We had made contact with the family members that night. They had notified us that he was at work, and from work called them and told them he was going to leave town and go to Charleston.
The last thing investigators need is for Justin to leave town.
Family members were asked to see if he would come back to Walterboro and talk to law enforcement.
Justin told them that he was in Ravenel, South Carolina at the time, and that he would agree to come back and speak with them in reference to the shooting.
This time, you knew he had a violent past in history, and that also that they had domestic violence between each other. So they want to get him in custody as soon as possible.
Taking no chances, investigators ping Justin's phone so they can follow his movements.
Investigators obtained a search warrant through Verizon for the GPS data location and cell phone mapping. We have an investigator with our office who conducts all the mathematical information and basically is able to show what that information means.
He was in the area of the Forest Point Apartments at the time of the murder and then headed north to the Ravenel area and then back into the Walterboro area.
The pings kind of confirmed that he was making his way back.
But suddenly, his route changes.
They noticed by picking his phone that he wasn't coming towards the police station at all.
There was a bolo put out. Be on the lookout for a white single cab GMC that was en route coming from the Charleston area.
Officers with the Colleton County Sheriff's Office located him in the area of Roberts and Boulevard, conducted a traffic stop on him.
They did a felony stop on him because you're high risk at that time because they knew he probably had a gun on him.
Put the car and park and turn the vehicle off. Take your left hand and open the door outside. Step out with your hands up. Hands on your head. Hands up. Step out with your hands up. Step out.
The police had their guns drawn. They asked for Justin to get out the car. He got out the car. He complied, and then they took him to custody.
We went ahead and towed the vehicle and seized his phone at the time, and he was transported to our Criminal Investigations Division for an interview.
Walterboro PD took him in for an interview. When he was told of Denaja's death, he was not very emotional.
Investigators asked Justin where he was at 10 p.m.
Justin had said, he left work around 10 and traveled to Charleston.
And then he had gone to see a friend in Ravenel, and they went to downtown Charleston from there. When questioned about exactly where they went and what they did, he was very short on answers. He couldn't tell them really anything at all.
Justin says his friend goes by the name Blessing Doctor. But Justin's version of his whereabouts don't match what investigators saw when they tracked his phone.
He had given us specific locations of where he had been in downtown Charleston. None of that showed on his GPS coordinates.
As suspicions around Justin grow, detectives ask him for one more thing.
During that interview, they presented him with a GSR kit. He consented.
A gunshot residue test is where a person's hands are swabbed, and what it is, the chemical blowback from a gun. When you fire a gun, it'll leave a residue in your hands. And we swab your hands. We can tell if you fired a gun within the last 24 hours.
It's not an instant test. It takes time. There's a lot of factors that play into that testing.
At one point during that interview, he did request a lawyer, so we had to let him go. I didn't have enough probable cause to arrest him at that point.
Investigators attempt to contact the man Justin said he spent the evening with.
The individual they identified as being Blessing Doctor, no one could ever make contact with him. Nobody knew anything about that individual.
It wasn't a strong alibi. In the end, I just don't think for investigators it was enough to say Justin had absolutely no part in this.
Needless to say, at that point, he's on our radar. We're going to do our best to kind of track his movements.
Investigators in South Carolina have a single suspect in the brutal shooting death of Denaja Holloway. Her ex-boyfriend, Justin Carroll. The day after the murder, they secure a warrant to search his truck.
Myself and another officer, we went through the truck. There was nothing in the truck to take. It had been completely cleaned out, and that kind of added to our suspicion.
Investigators seek a search warrant for both Justin and Denaja's phones. While they wait, they get a lucky break.
My next step was executing the search warrant for Denaja's phone. We knew that she had been with a male companion of some kind on vacation, presumably in some sort of romantic relationship. I kind of had a hunch that maybe he would know her passcode to her phone. So we went to his residence, asked if he had it, and he gave it to us. And so that way we were able to access the cell phone.
An individual lives their life through social media, texting, phone calls, communicating with friends and family. You could find a life story and history of day-to-day events of what is going on in that individual's life.
When we got into the cell phone, we went to the camera roll in the phone, and there was a saved video in the camera roll portion of the phone. It was a very short, maybe 8 to 10 second clip of Justin Carroll outside of Denaja's what appeared to be a car door. The timestamp and the date was exact to our homicide.
Denaja instantly felt this threat. She parked next to a Walterboro police vehicle, which in the instance is the safest thing to do, is trying to be as close to law enforcement as you possibly can put yourself. So she saw that immediate threat, and that's when Denaja pulled out her cell phone and began recording this interaction on Snapchat.
Miss Holloway said, saw me in my vehicle, he's following me in my parking lot, and I'm locking my doors. So she's trying to get away from him. She wanted nothing to do with him. She even locked her doors. And he still walked up on her trying to have a conversation.
And it was very clear that it was Justin Carroll on the video.
He's wearing a COVID mask around his chin. As he approaches the vehicle, he does pull the mask up over his face. At that point, the video ends.
Seconds later, Denaja was killed.
The phone never uploaded the information to social media.
The video did not show the actual crime, just the fact that he was there and that he had been approaching her at the time of the crime, or near the time of the crime.
Investigators note that Justin's appearance in the video is different from what he looked like in his interview, just a few hours later.
They noticed in the Snapchat video that Justin had a full head of hair, a lot of big hair all over his head. But during the interview, it was shaved.
Individuals who commit a crime will usually try to change their appearance to include changing of the clothing, haircuts, facial hair.
They knew something was up because it was totally different than what it was on the video prior to the day before. So they was very concerned about him fleeing the area and trying to conceal his identity.
If Justin did shoot Denaja, he likely tried to cover his tracks immediately.
I think he probably went to somebody's house, cleaned up, showered, shaved his head, cleaned out his truck, and got rid of the gun. Because when Colleton County Sheriff's Office pulled him over, one thing that they noticed about that truck was it was extremely clean. There was not a cup, a piece of paper, a fast food bag, anything in that truck.
Looking at the timeline of what happened, he had likely ditched the gun somewhere on the way out of town, on the way to Charleston or towards that area. We couldn't exactly pinpoint where he may have tossed the gun.
With or without a gun, the video is the evidence investigators need.
At that point, we felt comfortable enough to go ahead and secure the arrest warrant for Justin Carroll.
But they need to act fast.
This time, the investigators feel that he was trying to conceal his identity and probably flee.
On May 24th, 2021, 2 days after Denaja Holloway was gunned down, Walterboro police prepare to arrest her suspected killer.
Number one, you have the gunshot residue on his hands that clearly show that he had shot a gun within the last 24 hours. And then also you have the Snapchat from Mrs. Holloway's phone that shows him clearly walking up to her at the crime scene on the same night, the same time frame.
If investigators hadn't found that video as quickly as they did, he could have already been far gone.
But investigators have kept a close eye on Justin since his interview. So, on the night of May 24th, they know exactly where to find him.
When we arrested Justin Carroll, he was working at the local Pizza Hut at the time. He didn't put up any sort of fight or argument or anything like that.
And at that time, he had a mask on that he wore around his neck. This was similar to the one on the Snapchat.
If Justin had been planning to flee, he never made it.
They proceeded to conduct a secondary interview on Justin Carroll. Justin did not elaborate on any further about the incident.
If you still want to talk to us, would you still want a lawyer like he's dead? I still want a lawyer.
He refused still to talk this time. He asked for an attorney. So at this time, he's still playing hardball.
They collected the cell phone from him at that time, and they impounded the truck.
Investigators finally received the search warrant for Justin's phone.
We had the forensic dumps of the cell phones. Cole's phone seemed to have been pretty much wiped clean. The text message exchange that appeared on Denasia's phone was actually not on Cole's phone at all.
The oldest text messages between Denasia and Justin were sent 5 days before the murder.
Her messages began with Justin Carroll when she went to Jacksonville, Florida on vacation. Justin basically was trying to start conversation with her about, money, needing items for work, that he still was in love with her. And then quickly the conversation turned jealous, and he started accusing her of being with somebody else.
When she did respond finally that she was in Fort Lauderdale and that she was with someone new, I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And he said, "Go ahead and have fun while you can." To me, that seems like the threat.
Males that are a perpetrator of domestic violence, they feel like their victims are their property. And because of that, they can never, date anybody, go with anybody. And Justin's mind, she was always going to be his girl. That means his property.
5 days later, Denasia returned home to Walterboro.
There was some serious concern about her driving home with her own vehicle. Her father allowed her to take his vehicle and drive home to her apartment in Walterboro.
She left her parents' house at about 9 p.m. that night, and he was on her tail as soon as she came into the apartment complex, which was about 10:07. I don't know how he knew exactly when she was getting home, but he did. He had obviously been watching and waiting.
There was nobody else around that vehicle at the time. It was just him, and ultimately he pulled a gun and shot her multiple times.
Justin is in custody, but bringing him to justice will be up to prosecutors. They know a guilty verdict isn't guaranteed.
It is a circumstantial case in that the entire murder was not caught on film, but everything conclusively pointed to Cole. And when you put all the pieces together, that's when you see the big picture.
In April 2024, Justin Carroll goes on trial for the murder of Denasia Holloway.
It took almost 3 years to get to trial in this case, but we did finally get there.
Denasia had a large group of family supporters backing her, her mother, father, family members. Everybody showing up to show support and want justice for this crime.
Mom gets very, very emotional. It was very difficult for her to take the stand, but it was very important, and she knew that. She was able to lay some of that foundation.
She talked about Justin's first arrest, having to call 911, the urgency of having to pack up Justin's things to get them out of the apartment, even having to change her daughter's cell phone number several different times. It was a very scary and stressful situation for the both of them.
After the breakup and despite the no contact order, Justin continued to harass and threaten Denasia.
So at that time, he could not text her, he could not call her, leaving kind of message through a friend or family. He had no contact at all. It was what the order says. But he violated several times because he refused not to stop seeing her, texting her, harassing her. He stalked her, and he simply would not stop.
Although no forensic evidence definitively places Justin at the scene, the result of a gunshot residue test is another strike against him.
The interesting thing about the gunshot residue evidence in this case is that there was just one particle on him of gunshot residue. Gunshot residue begins to slough off of you as soon as you shoot or are near a shot firearm. We believe that Justin Cole Carroll went and cleaned up and changed shirts, but this was one particle that he missed, and there's no reason that he should have had any gunshot residue on him, given what he was telling police. The best evidence that we had was a video that had come from Denasia Holloway's camera. I've never had my victim be the star witness in a murder case before, and thankfully, she took that video and was able to get justice for herself. I mean, that's incredible. I've never seen a piece of evidence like that. She was able to speak to the jury from the grave.
These, key pieces of evidence are coming out against Justin. The gunshot residue, the video. Those are the things that really make it hard to believe that he didn't do it.
Justin's defense is straightforward.
Their defense was that there's reasonable doubt, that you can't really see him in the video's not that clear.
After less than 30 minutes of deliberation, the jury delivers its verdict.
The verdict was guilty, and he was sentenced to 60 years.
When the final verdict came out, Denasia's family was a sense of relief. Instant tears between all family members.
Denasia's family was point blank saying this would have never happened if he had not been let out on bond for his first charge. They were frustrated with that because if the judge had not made that decision, Denasia would possibly still be here today. She was only 22 and she was the only daughter in the family. And there's nothing that will ever fill that hole for them.
I wish that we had been alerted that he was having contact with her prior to the murder. But it's difficult. You don't know whether you're going to stir something up or stop something. And I think she was doing the best she could. It is tough to protect yourself from people that resort to this kind of violence over a very small thing.
What should have happened was, and this is what we always kind of advocate for, if she had let it be known or had the awareness to know that every time he reached out to me, even with it via text, Instagram, social media, let the police know, make them aware, because he could have been in jail. At the end of the day, I feel like this will bring awareness to our young African American women to, if you're in a domestic violence situation, get away and make sure you contact the police.
On a quiet stretch of Alberta Highway in 2010, the kind of road where the landscape seems to swallow sound before it can travel far, an RV rolled forward under a pale Canadian sky. Inside it, Lyle and Marie McCann were doing something they had done many times before, traveling together, planning stops, living out a retirement rhythm built on movement rather than stillness. For most drivers passing them that day, they would have been nothing more than another older couple on the road, windows reflecting fields, forests, and the long, open distance that defines Western Canada. They were never seen alive again after that journey. What remains of their final days is not a sequence of moments witnessed in full, but fragments collected later by investigators trying to reconstruct a story the road itself refused to preserve. A fuel stop here, a store receipt there, a timeline that moves forward normally until it suddenly stops making sense. Because at some point during that trip, something intersected with their route, and the RV carrying their lives forward became something else entirely. A sealed space of unanswered questions moving through public highways before disappearing into silence. When the McCanns were reported missing, it did not immediately register as a national crisis. At first, it looked like the kind of concern that families feel when communication fails unexpectedly. Phones go unanswered. Plans are missed. Delays happen. But as hours turned into days, the absence of contact became heavier, more structured, less explainable by chance. The RV was not just late. It was gone. Search efforts expanded quickly across Alberta's rural corridors, where distances are measured not in minutes, but in stretches of road that feel longer than they are. Helicopters scanned tree lines. Ground teams moved through uneven terrain. Police retraced possible routes based on fuel usage, expected stops, and the couple's known habits. But the landscape offered very little in return. It is one of the defining characteristics of that region. It does not easily reveal what it has absorbed. Then came the RV. It was found burned. Fire had consumed much of what would normally tell a story. The interior was damaged to the point where identification of events inside the vehicle became difficult. Metal frames twisted, surfaces charred, compartments reduced to outlines of their former function. For investigators, a burned vehicle is both a clue and a problem. It signals intentional destruction, but it also erases the fine details that allow reconstruction of what occurred before ignition. What it did not provide was closure. And more importantly, it did not provide the bodies of Lyle and Marie McCann. That absence changed everything. Because now the case was no longer about a missing couple who might have lost contact or encountered an accident. It became a missing persons investigation without the most expected element of resolution: remains. The RV had been reduced to evidence of destruction, but not confirmation of death in the traditional forensic sense. It left investigators in a space where they had to infer outcomes from behavior, timing, and the absence of survival indicators. In situations like this, uncertainty becomes its own kind of pressure. Every new detail has to carry more weight because it is standing in for something that is no longer physically present. As investigators traced movements around the time of disappearance, attention eventually shifted toward individuals seen near the area where the RV was last known to have traveled. Among those names that emerged during the investigation was Travis Vader, a man with a history that placed him within the orbit of property crimes and unstable living conditions in rural Alberta. He was not initially presented as a definitive suspect in the public imagination, but as someone of interest within a widening investigative field. What mattered was not just his presence in the broader timeline, but how that presence aligned with the disappearance window and the subsequent discovery of the burned RV. Investigators began to build a narrative not from eyewitness accounts of a crime itself, but from circumstantial convergence, opportunity, proximity, and forensic traces that did not immediately explain themselves, but pointed in a direction that demanded examination. Without bodies, the investigation faced a critical challenge. In homicide cases, physical remains often provide the clearest answers. Cause of death, time of death, sequence of injuries. Here, none of that existed in complete form. The absence of remains meant that prosecutors would later have to construct their case using inference drawn from circumstantial evidence, environmental findings, and behavior patterns, rather than direct forensic confirmation of death. And yet the case did not stall. Instead, it intensified, because the burned RV itself became a central object of interpretation. Fire damage, when analyzed carefully, can still reveal patterns. Origin points, accelerants, direction of spread, whether a fire was accidental or deliberate. Investigators examined what was left with the understanding that destruction is rarely total in meaning, even when it is physically complete. Something always remains in the structure of damage. At the same time, the emotional dimension of the case expanded. Family members of Lyle and Marie McCann spoke publicly about the disorientation of not knowing. There is a particular kind of grief that forms when death is suspected but not confirmed, when there is no grave, no body, no final moment to anchor mourning. It leaves families suspended between hope and conclusion, forced to imagine outcomes without certainty. For investigators, that emotional weight translated into urgency. But urgency in a case like this does not automatically produce clarity. It can sometimes deepen the complexity, especially when physical evidence is limited and multiple interpretive paths remain open. As months turned into years, the investigation continued to develop. Statements were revisited. Forensic analyses were re-examined. Technological advances allowed for new interpretations of older evidence. The burned RV remained a central artifact, but it was no longer the only focus. The timeline around the disappearance became more refined, with attention given to the couple's movements, communications, and the last confirmed points where they were seen interacting with the world. Meanwhile, Travis Vader's name remained connected to the case through investigative continuity. What began as suspicion evolved over time into a legal process that would eventually place him at the center of prosecution. But even then, the case did not become straightforward. It was not built on a single decisive piece of evidence. It was constructed across multiple threads: circumstantial links, forensic interpretation, and the broader pattern of disappearance followed by destruction of the vehicle. One of the most challenging aspects of the McCann case is that it forces a shift in how people understand proof. In most criminal cases, the body is the anchor. It confirms that death occurred and provides the physical narrative of how it happened. In this case, the absence of that anchor meant the legal system had to rely on a different kind of reconstruction, one built from absence itself. Absence of contact, absence of movement, absence of survival signals, and finally, absence of bodies. Each absence, taken alone, could be explained. Together, they formed a structure that pointed toward a conclusion the court system would eventually be asked to evaluate. When Travis Vader was brought to trial, the central question was not only what happened to Lyle and Marie McCann, but whether the accumulated circumstantial evidence could meet the legal threshold required for conviction in the absence of remains. The prosecution argued that the totality of evidence demonstrated unlawful killing and subsequent concealment of bodies. The defense challenged the reliability of inference, emphasizing the lack of direct forensic confirmation of death, and questioning whether the evidence could exclude alternative explanations. The courtroom became a space where uncertainty was not just present but central. Every argument had to account for what was missing as much as what was present. Witness testimony described timelines and observations, but no one could testify to the exact moment the couple disappeared from the system of observable life. Forensic experts spoke about the burned vehicle and what it suggested, but even fire science has limits when destruction is extensive. What emerged was a trial defined by reconstruction rather than certainty. And in the end, the court reached a verdict of guilt on counts related to their deaths, marking one of the most controversial aspects of the case: a murder conviction without recovered bodies. For some, it represented a necessary acknowledgement that modern investigations cannot always depend on physical remains. For others, it raised difficult questions about the boundaries of reasonable doubt when the most fundamental piece of evidence is absent. Sentencing followed, but the case did not close in the way cases are often expected to close. There was no graveside, no final confirmation of remains, no physical return of the McCanns to their family. Legally, the matter was resolved. Emotionally, it remained suspended. Even after conviction, discussions around the case continued. Legal analysts debated the implications of convicting without a body. Investigators reflected on the challenges of rural disappearances, where environmental factors and time can erase evidence more effectively than any human action. Families continued to live with a form of loss that is permanent but unfinalized. And in the background of all these discussions remains the image that started it all. An RV moving steadily down a highway, carrying two people through a landscape that seemed open and safe, until it was not. What happened between that movement and the burned vehicle found later is the space where certainty disappears. And in that space, the McCann case continues to exist, not as a complete narrative, but as an unresolved tension between what was proven in court and what was never physically recovered from the land that swallowed it. To understand the disappearance of Lyle and Marie McCann, it is necessary to step away from the moment everything went wrong and look instead at the life they were living before that final journey began, because nothing about their case exists in isolation. Their story is not only about a crime scene that was never fully recovered, but about two people who had reached a stage of life where movement itself had become a form of identity. They were a retired couple from Alberta, people who had spent decades building routines that eventually gave way to freedom. Retirement, for them, was not a retreat into stillness, but an expansion into travel. The RV was more than transportation. It was a small, mobile version of home, carrying the essentials of daily life into landscapes that changed constantly outside the windows. For many who knew them, this lifestyle was familiar among retirees in Western Canada, where long highways and vast distances make road travel not just practical, but almost cultural. Lyle McCann was often described as steady, practical, someone who understood systems and maintenance in the quiet way of people who have spent a lifetime fixing what breaks before it becomes a problem. He was the kind of person who checked fuel levels twice, who planned routes with attention to detail, who likely understood the risks of long-distance travel in remote areas better than most. Marie McCann, by contrast, was remembered as engaged and observant, someone who participated fully in the experience of travel rather than treating it as mere logistics. Together, they formed a balance that many couples achieve only after years of shared adaptation. Their decision to travel in 2010 was not unusual in itself. Summer months in Alberta and neighboring provinces often see retirees moving through national parks, provincial roads, and rural stops, following weather patterns and personal curiosity rather than strict schedules. The RV lifestyle allows for flexibility, but it also requires trust in infrastructure that becomes thinner the farther one moves from urban centers. Gas stations become sparse, towns smaller, and stretches of road longer and emptier. On paper, their route was unremarkable. It followed expected corridors, connecting known stops. There was nothing in their plans that suggested danger. And that is part of what later made the case so disorienting for investigators. There was no obvious deviation in intention before the disappearance. No known conflict. No reported threats. No indication that their journey had intersected with anything hostile until the moment it did. The RV itself was a self-contained environment. For couples like the McCanns, it represented independence. Food, shelter, mobility, and familiarity all combined into a single vehicle. But that same self-containment becomes significant in hindsight, because when something disrupts that enclosed world, the disruption remains inside it. Unlike a home, which is anchored to a location, an RV moves through public space continuously. That means any incident occurring inside or around it is also moving, carried forward through roads and distances, before it ever becomes visible as a problem. In the days before their disappearance was recognized, there was nothing outwardly alarming to those who might have seen them. This is often the most unsettling aspect of missing persons cases involving travel. Life appears normal from the outside, right up until the moment it is not. As investigators later reconstructed, the McCanns were last confirmed on surveillance and transactional records, moving through expected points along their route. These fragments are important because they establish presence without capturing context. A fuel purchase confirms location at a specific time. A store receipt confirms interaction with a commercial system. But neither reveals what was happening inside the RV itself, or who else might have been nearby during those moments. This gap between external documentation and internal reality is where uncertainty begins to grow. It is also where investigators must begin building hypotheses. In rural Alberta, especially along less populated highways, there are long stretches where vehicles pass without witnesses. Trees line the road in some areas, open fields in others. Visibility can be high, but observation is not guaranteed. A vehicle can disappear from one point and reappear miles later without anyone noticing the interval between. For the McCanns, this meant that the critical window of time when they were last seen alive and when they were reported missing was already partially unobservable from the start. Investigators knew where they had been. They did not know precisely when or where things changed. As the search expanded, attention naturally turned toward anomalies. In missing persons investigations, anomalies are often the first indicators of foul play. A vehicle abandoned where it should not be. Signs of fire or disturbance. Items out of place. In this case, the discovery of the burned RV provided one such anomaly, but it also complicated interpretation because fire destroys as much as it reveals. Before that discovery, however, the investigation operated in a state of uncertainty. Search teams canvassed routes. Air support scanned forested areas. Local authorities coordinated with provincial resources. The McCanns were treated as potentially endangered, but not yet confirmed victims of homicide. That distinction matters, because it shapes how evidence is prioritized and how urgency is framed. Meanwhile, public attention began to grow. Cases involving missing older couples traveling by RV carry a particular emotional resonance. They challenge assumptions about safety in familiar activities. Road travel is often perceived as controlled risk, predictable and routine. When it results in disappearance, it forces a re-evaluation of that assumption. As days passed without contact, concern escalated. Family members provided investigators with background information about habits, routines, and communication patterns. These details are crucial in establishing what is normal versus what is abnormal for the individuals involved. In the McCann case, normality had been consistent communication and predictable movement. The sudden absence of both created a clear deviation. It is during this phase of an investigation that theories begin to form, even before physical evidence is fully processed. Investigators consider accident scenarios, voluntary disappearance, medical emergencies, and criminal interference. Each possibility is weighed against available facts, but none can yet be confirmed. The eventual discovery of the burned RV would later shift the direction of the investigation significantly, but at this early stage, before that confirmation, the case existed in a liminal state between missing persons and suspected foul play. What makes this phase particularly important in retrospective analysis is that it reveals how fragile the boundary between categories can be. A case can move from one classification to another based on a single piece of evidence, such as a vehicle, a location, or a forensic finding. Until that moment, investigators must operate with restraint, avoiding premature conclusions while still preparing for worst-case scenarios. In parallel, the environment itself played a role. Alberta's geography is not passive in these cases. It shapes visibility, accessibility, and the speed at which searches can be conducted. Remote highways are not just backdrops, they are active factors in both concealment and discovery. Weather conditions, terrain difficulty, and distance from population centers all contribute to how quickly information can be gathered. For the McCanns, this meant that time was an invisible but critical variable. Every hour that passed without confirmation increased the complexity of the search. Not because the situation necessarily changed, but because evidence becomes harder to recover with time. Even before any suspect was publicly identified, investigators understood that if a crime had occurred, it likely took place in an environment where observation was limited. That understanding guided how they interpreted early findings and how they approached potential witnesses along the route. What they did not yet have was a narrative that could explain transformation from a functioning travel itinerary into disappearance, followed by destruction. That narrative would only begin to form after the RV was found. But at this stage, the story was still incomplete in a more fundamental way. It was a series of movements without a confirmed ending. A couple traveling through familiar systems of road and service stations, and then nothing that could account for their absence. And that absence, in investigative terms, is never neutral. It is always waiting to be filled, either by discovery or by interpretation. In every missing persons case that later turns into a homicide investigation, there is a point where the focus shifts from what happened on the road to who the people were before they ever left home. For Lyle and Marie McCann, that shift is essential, because their disappearance does not begin with violence that can be immediately seen, but with the absence of two lives that had structure, routine, and emotional presence within their family and community. Lyle McCann was not a man who lived loosely in the world. Those who knew him often described a personality shaped by responsibility, the kind of person who measured decisions in terms of consequences rather than impulse. In retirement, this tendency did not disappear. It simply changed form. Instead of work schedules and obligations, he applied that same discipline to travel planning, maintenance of their RV, and the careful mapping of routes across provinces. There is a particular mindset among long-term travelers like him, one that treats preparation as a form of safety and control in environments that are otherwise unpredictable. Marie McCann complemented that structure in a different way. Where Lyle represented planning and mechanical certainty, Marie brought continuity in the emotional sense. She was engaged in the experience of travel, attentive to the places they visited and the people they encountered. Friends and family often described her as someone who maintained connection easily, someone who would remember details about conversations and carry them forward. Together, they were not simply a couple traveling, but a system of shared awareness, each balancing the other's strengths. Their RV lifestyle was not accidental. It was a conscious choice that reflected a broader cultural pattern among retirees in Canada, particularly in regions where distance is a defining feature of geography. The RV becomes more than transportation. It becomes a temporary home that moves through landscapes rather than remaining fixed in one place. This mobility offers freedom, but it also introduces vulnerability that is often underestimated. When a home moves, so does everything inside it, including any danger that may enter without warning. In the months leading up to their final trip, there was nothing publicly known that suggested instability in their lives. No reported disputes, no known conflicts, no indication that they were being targeted or followed. To investigators who later examined their history, this lack of prior warning was significant. Many violent crimes show some form of escalation or pre-contact between victim and offender. In this case, there was no documented bridge between the McCanns and what would eventually happen to them. This absence of connection is part of what made the case so difficult to conceptualize in its early stages. When investigators try to reconstruct missing persons cases, they often begin by identifying networks: family, friends, financial contacts, workplace relationships, or prior conflicts. These networks provide potential pathways through which harm could enter a person's life. For Lyle and Marie McCann, those pathways appeared limited and stable. Their family relationships were described as close. Communication with relatives was regular and consistent. There was no indication of estrangement or financial distress that might explain voluntary disappearance. They were not people who appeared to be attempting to escape their lives. On the contrary, everything suggested continuity. That continuity is important because it narrows the range of plausible explanations in the early investigative phase. When people of stable routines disappear during travel, investigators must consider environmental accident, medical emergency, voluntary disappearance, and criminal interference. Each category carries different implications for search strategy and urgency. In the McCann case, initial assumptions leaned toward accident or misadventure in a remote area. This is a common starting point in rural disappearances, especially when travel routes pass through forests, lakes, and long stretches of unmonitored highway. The possibility of mechanical failure, getting lost, or encountering an environmental hazard is always present in such regions. RV travel, while generally safe, still involves exposure to terrain that can be unforgiving when things go wrong. But even within that framework, certain aspects of the McCann case stood out. Their RV was not simply missing, it was later found burned. That fact alone would fundamentally alter interpretation, but even before that discovery, investigators were already dealing with an unusual absence of communication and traceability beyond expected points on their route. At the family level, the disappearance created an immediate rupture in normal expectation. Relatives who were accustomed to regular updates suddenly found themselves without any contact. This is often the first emotional signal that something is wrong, even before law enforcement confirms it. Families begin making calls, checking locations, retracing possible stops. That emotional labor becomes part of the early investigation, even though it is not formal evidence. As concern escalated, police began gathering detailed information about the McCann's habits. These details are not incidental. In missing persons cases, understanding behavioral patterns is critical. Did they normally check in at specific times? Did they deviate from planned routes frequently? Were they comfortable with unplanned stops or strictly structured in their travel behavior? Each answer helps determine whether a deviation is likely accidental or significant. For Lyle and Marie, the pattern suggested predictability. They were not described as impulsive travelers. They followed planned routes and maintained communication expectations. That predictability made the sudden silence more pronounced. Another important element in reconstructing their lives is understanding their relationship with their RV itself. For many long-term travelers, the vehicle becomes an extension of identity. It is maintained carefully, stocked with supplies, and treated as a safe space in unfamiliar environments. This sense of security is psychologically important, because it means that when something disrupts that space, the disruption is not just physical, but deeply personal. When investigators later examined the burned RV, that symbolic dimension became even more significant. But at this stage of the investigation, before that discovery, the RV still represented safety and normality. It was the environment in which the McCanns were last known to exist as a functioning unit of daily life. As days passed without contact, the emotional tone around the case shifted. What begins as concern gradually becomes fear, and then uncertainty solidifies into anticipation of discovery. Law enforcement, meanwhile, began coordinating search efforts that extended across rural highways and surrounding areas. These searches are shaped by probability models, based on last known location and expected travel distance, but they are always constrained by geography and time. In cases like this, one of the most difficult realities is that absence of evidence does not remain static. It decays. The longer a search takes, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish between absence due to distance and absence due to concealment or destruction. This is why early hours and days are critical, even in large geographic areas. For the McCanns, however, those early hours did not yield clear answers. No confirmed sightings after the last known points. No emergency communications. No mechanical distress signals. Only silence stretching across a landscape that offered few witnesses. That silence is what eventually led investigators to broaden their scope from missing persons to potential criminal involvement, even before any physical evidence confirmed that shift. In investigative practice, this is a necessary adaptation. When a case fails to resolve within expected parameters, assumptions must evolve. Still, at this stage, everything remained theoretical. The McCanns were not yet confirmed victims of a crime in the legal sense. They were individuals whose disappearance could still, in theory, be explained by unknown but non-criminal circumstances. That ambiguity is what makes early investigative phases so unstable. What is now clear in hindsight is that their lives before the disappearance contained none of the visible markers that often precede violent cases. No escalation of conflict. No financial collapse. No known enemies. This absence of motive does not eliminate the possibility of crime, but it complicates how that crime can be understood once it is suspected. And so, before the burned RV was found, before suspects were named, before legal proceedings began, the McCann case existed as something more fragile than a solved or unsolved crime. It existed as a disruption in a predictable life pattern, unfolding across a road that should have led them somewhere else entirely, but instead led into silence. The moment everything changed in the McCann investigation is not defined by the disappearance itself, but by what was eventually found after the silence had already settled. In cases like this, there is often a delayed impact between the last known sighting and the physical evidence that confirms the worst fears. For Lyle and Marie McCann, that delay stretched across days that felt uncertain for the family and increasingly procedural for law enforcement, until a single discovery forced the case into a completely different category. The RV was found burned. That sentence, simple as it is in documentation, carries the weight of an entire transformation in investigative direction. Because a missing vehicle is ambiguous, but a burned vehicle is not neutral. Fire is not passive. It is either accidental in origin or deliberately applied, and investigators are trained to read that distinction carefully even when the damage is severe. In this case, the condition of the RV immediately suggested that whatever had happened to the McCanns was no longer limited to disappearance. Something had actively erased part of the physical record. The location where the RV was discovered added another layer of significance. It was not found in a place consistent with a routine stop or mechanical failure. It had been removed from the flow of normal travel and placed into a context that suggested concealment. When investigators arrive at a burned vehicle in a remote or semi-remote area, their first task is not to interpret motive, but to reconstruct sequence. What arrived first, the occupants, or the fire? Where did ignition begin? Was the vehicle moved? Were there signs of struggle prior to burning? In the McCann case, the fire had done what fire always does in forensic environments. It reduced clarity. Interior materials were destroyed or deformed beyond recognition in many areas. Organic evidence that might have indicated presence or injury was compromised. This is one of the reasons burned vehicles are so difficult in criminal investigations. They do not simply damage evidence, they reorganize it into ambiguity. But even in destruction, patterns remain. Investigators examined burn patterns to determine origin points. They looked for indicators of accelerants, which can suggest intentional ignition rather than accidental fire. They analyzed structural deformation to understand how long the fire burned and whether it was consistent with a controlled or uncontrolled event. Each of these observations contributes to a larger reconstruction, even when the original scene has been heavily compromised. At the same time, another critical fact shaped the interpretation. Lyle and Marie McCann were not found inside the RV. This absence immediately expanded the scope of the investigation. If the fire had resulted in fatalities, the expectation would be to recover remains, even in partial form. The fact that no bodies were present meant that the individuals had either been removed before the fire or were never inside at the time of ignition. Both possibilities carry very different implications, but neither suggests a natural or accidental disappearance. From this point forward, the case could no longer be treated as a missing persons investigation in the traditional sense. The burned RV functioned as a transition point, converting uncertainty into suspicion of criminal activity. As forensic teams processed the vehicle, attention turned to trace evidence. Even in heavily damaged environments, small fragments can survive. Metal components, partial biological traces, residue patterns, and structural anomalies all contribute to reconstructing events. Investigators documented everything methodically, understanding that in cases with limited physical evidence, interpretation becomes dependent on accumulation rather than singular proof. While forensic work continued, parallel investigative tracks focused on the McCann's final known movements. This is standard procedure in cases involving vehicles, because the route leading up to discovery often holds as much significance as the discovery itself. Investigators retraced highways, intersections, and service points, looking for surveillance footage, witness observations, or transactional records that could narrow the timeline between last confirmed sighting and disappearance. What emerged was a narrowing window of time in which contact was lost, and the RV was no longer accounted for in expected locations. That window is crucial because it defines the space in which any interaction with external individuals or events must have occurred. At the same time, the absence of Lyle and Marie from the burned vehicle forced investigators to consider scenarios involving abduction or forced removal. In rural environments, such scenarios are particularly difficult to reconstruct because they often occur without witnesses and without immediate reporting. Unlike urban settings, where surveillance systems and population density create overlapping observation, rural highways offer long stretches where activity goes unrecorded. As the investigation progressed, the focus began to shift toward individuals who had been present in the broader area during the relevant timeframe. One of those individuals was Travis Vader, whose name entered the investigative record through association with movements and observations that intersected with the McCann's travel path. At this stage, however, his role was still part of a wider evidentiary mapping process rather than a confirmed suspect profile in the public narrative. What mattered to investigators was convergence. In complex disappearance cases, suspicion does not arise from a single action, but from alignment of opportunity, proximity, and behavior patterns with the timeline of the event. When multiple independent indicators begin pointing toward the same individual, that convergence becomes significant enough to warrant deeper scrutiny. Still, investigators faced a persistent challenge: the absence of direct evidence linking any individual to the McCanns at the moment of disappearance. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses to an interaction, no recorded communication between the couple and any suspect, no physical remains to provide direct forensic linkage. This meant that every step in the investigative process had to rely on inference supported by environmental and circumstantial data. Meanwhile, the burned RV continued to be analyzed in detail. Fire investigators focused on understanding whether the burn pattern indicated an attempt to destroy evidence after an event had already occurred. In many criminal cases involving vehicle fires, The timing of ignition relative to occupant presence is critical. A fire started after occupants have been removed suggests concealment. A fire occurring with occupants inside suggests a different category of crime entirely. In the McCann case, the absence of remains meant that the fire could not be interpreted as a simple fatal event. It had to be understood as part of a sequence that included disappearance prior to burning. This sequence is what ultimately shaped the direction of the entire investigation. As forensic and field investigations progressed simultaneously, the emotional weight on the McCann family intensified. Unlike cases where a body is recovered and grief begins to take a defined shape, this case remained suspended between loss and uncertainty. Families in such situations often describe a psychological state that is neither hope nor acceptance, but something unstable in between, where each new development could potentially confirm either survival or death. Law enforcement agencies, meanwhile, began preparing for the possibility that the case involved deliberate criminal action, followed by concealment. This preparation is not based on certainty, but on probability derived from evidence patterns. The burned RV, the missing occupants, and the disrupted timeline together created a framework that made accidental explanations increasingly difficult to sustain. However, even as suspicion increased, the investigative standard remained unchanged. Without direct proof, conclusions could not be finalized. This tension between evidentiary caution and interpretive necessity is one of the defining features of complex disappearance cases. By the end of this phase, the McCann investigation had moved fully into criminal territory in practice, even if not yet fully resolved in legal terms. The burned RV stood as the central artifact of the case, representing both destruction and the beginning of a structured attempt to understand what had been erased. And in that destruction, the case acquired its defining characteristic: not the absence of answers, but the presence of a single object that confirmed something irreversible had occurred, even if the full story behind it still remained out of reach. No one who arrived at the McCann RV that day would later describe it as dramatic in the way crime stories are often imagined. There were no flashing neon signs of violence, no obvious theatrical evidence of struggle, no immediate, unmistakable confirmation of what had happened. Instead, what greeted investigators was something far more unsettling: normality that had been carefully interrupted. The RV sat at the edge of a remote stretch of Alberta wilderness, positioned awkwardly between gravel and brush, as if it had been stopped mid-motion and never properly returned to its journey. The surrounding land was quiet in the way only rural Canada can be quiet: wind passing through thin trees, distant bird calls, and the occasional crunch of gravel under boots. But within that quiet, there was an absence that felt wrong, a silence that seemed to press inward. From a distance, the vehicle looked intact. There was no catastrophic wreckage, no shattered glass scattered across the ground, no obvious collision damage. But as investigators moved closer, subtle details began to emerge. The exterior showed signs of heat exposure, localized charring, faint soot patterns, and discoloration that suggested fire had touched the vehicle without consuming it entirely. It was not a wildfire. It was not accidental spread. It looked controlled, limited, and incomplete. The doors were intact, though one showed slight deformation near the frame. When officers first attempted to look inside, the air that escaped the RV carried a faint, stale odor, something burnt layered beneath something else, something organic and deeply unpleasant. It was not overpowering yet, but it was enough to make experienced officers pause and exchange silent looks. They had learned over years of fieldwork that certain smells did not need confirmation. They were confirmation. When the door was finally opened, the interior revealed a scene that would later be described in reports as orderly but wrong. The arrangement of objects inside did not reflect panic or chaos. Instead, it reflected interruption. Items remained in place, as if the occupants had only stepped away briefly and never returned. A half-consumed meal sat on a surface near the seating area. Folded blankets were still arranged in sleeping positions. Personal belongings were present but incomplete, as if selectively removed. There were no immediate signs of forced entry. No shattered locks. No broken windows. No obvious indication that someone had violently breached the space. That absence became one of the first major questions in the investigation. If this was an abduction or an attack, how had it been initiated without leaving clear physical evidence of intrusion? But the deeper investigators moved into the RV, the more contradictions appeared. The environment did not feel abandoned voluntarily. It felt staged in its abandonment. small inconsistencies accumulated. A cabinet slightly ajar in a way that suggested rushed searching. A misplaced item on the floor that did not align with natural movement. Faint residue marks suggesting something had been wiped or handled repeatedly. Near the rear of the vehicle, the odor intensified. The faint trace of burn and organic decay became more concentrated, guiding officers toward the area where the most significant damage had occurred. There, they observed localized fire effects, areas where heat had been applied long enough to alter materials, but not long enough to destroy the structure entirely. Plastic components were warped rather than melted completely. Upholstery showed partial charring. It was not a total burn. It was selective. That detail immediately raised concerns among investigators. Fire in cases like this is often associated with concealment. But concealment usually aims for completeness. This, however, felt interrupted. As if someone had attempted to erase evidence, but had been forced to stop, or had miscalculated the time required. Outside the RV, the surrounding terrain became the next focus. Search teams expanded their perimeter in widening circles, scanning for footprints, drag marks, tire impressions, or any physical trace of movement away from the vehicle. The ground was dry in places, soft in others, creating inconsistent conditions for tracking. That inconsistency worked against the investigation. Some impressions were visible but incomplete, broken by terrain or weather. Still, faint traces were documented. Partial footprints leading away from the RV area suggested human movement, but they lacked clarity. No single directional path was clearly dominant. Instead, the impressions appeared scattered, as if movement had occurred in multiple directions or under confusion. Investigators debated whether this represented multiple individuals or a single person moving back and forth under pressure. One theory quickly emerged. The McCanns may have been removed from the RV rather than leaving it on their own. The lack of defensive damage inside the vehicle supported this idea. There were no overturned chairs, no signs of prolonged struggle that one would expect if two adults had fought for survival within a confined space. But absence of struggle did not mean absence of force. It only meant that whatever had occurred may have been swift, controlled, or psychologically disorienting. Another possibility was deception. Investigators considered whether the couple may have been lured outside the RV voluntarily. This theory aligned with the intact nature of entry points. If someone had approached them under false pretenses, posing as law enforcement, offering assistance, or creating a believable emergency, they may have exited without resistance. But this theory introduced its own complications. It required a level of planning and social engineering that implied premeditation. As forensic teams continued their examination, they began collecting trace evidence. Microscopic particles embedded in surfaces were carefully removed. Fibers, residues, and any potential biological material were catalogued. In cases without bodies or direct witnesses, these fragments often become the foundation of reconstruction. Every particle had the potential to tell a fragment of the truth. Inside the RV, the atmosphere was described by one investigator as frozen in time, but missing time at the same time. That paradox became central to how the scene was later understood. It was not simply that something had happened there. It was that something had been removed from it in a way that disrupted normal narrative logic. Communication devices were notably absent. Personal electronics that would typically accompany travelers were either missing or not immediately found. This raised the possibility that communication had been intentionally cut off early in the sequence of events. If true, it suggested that isolation was part of the incident structure, not a byproduct. Outside, law enforcement expanded the timeline investigation. They began tracing the McCann's movements leading up to the discovery. Rest stops, fuel stations, and highway surveillance points were reviewed. Most footage showed a routine journey. Nothing in their behavior indicated distress. This normalcy made the disappearance even harder to interpret. There was no visible turning point moment captured on camera. No clear transition from safe travel to danger. As the day progressed, weather conditions began to shift slightly, introducing wind that complicated tracking efforts. Dust and loose debris could easily obscure faint footprints. Investigators understood that time was not neutral in cases like this. It was actively destructive. Every passing hour reduced the probability of recovering intact evidence. By the second day, media attention had begun to grow. The idea of an elderly couple disappearing during a routine RV trip resonated with public fear in a specific way. It was not a dramatic criminal spectacle. It was vulnerability in an everyday setting. People saw themselves in the McCanns. Retirees traveling peacefully, trusting roads and familiar systems, suddenly erased without explanation. But behind the public narrative, investigators were already narrowing their focus. They did not yet have suspects, but they had begun constructing behavioral models of the event. Was this opportunistic? Was it targeted? Was it random violence or something more deliberate? The condition of the RV suggested planning, but not perfection. The incomplete fire damage suggested interruption. The lack of clear theft suggested either selective motive or time pressure. The missing individuals suggested removal rather than immediate local violence. Each clue, however, led to another question rather than a conclusion. As night fell over the site, floodlights illuminated the RV from multiple angles, turning it into a sterile object under artificial light. In that light, every scratch, stain, and imperfection became more visible, but none became more explanatory. The vehicle stood as both evidence and absence, a container of something that had already been taken away. And as investigators continued to document, photograph, and analyze, one realization slowly solidified in the background of the case. This scene was not the end of the story, and it was not even the middle. It was only the first page of something far larger, something that would take years to fully unfold, if it ever could be understood at all. In the early stages of the McCann investigation, there is a moment every lead investigator recognizes: the transition from confusion to structured uncertainty. It is the point where the initial shock of the scene fades, and the real work begins. Not finding answers, but sorting through the endless possibilities of what those answers might be. At first, the disappearance of Lyle and Marie McCann presented itself as an open landscape of theories. Each one seemed plausible in isolation, yet none could fully survive contact with the available evidence. The absence of bodies, the partially damaged RV, the missing personal items, and the lack of a clear witness all created a vacuum that quickly filled with speculation. The earliest assumption was simple: a robbery gone wrong. It is often the default explanation in missing persons cases involving travelers. An elderly couple in an RV, possibly perceived as vulnerable, could have been targeted for cash, valuables, or the vehicle itself. On paper, it made sense. RVs are mobile, contain supplies, and can be sold or dismantled. But as investigators began to examine what was actually missing, this theory started to weaken. There was no clear evidence of systematic theft. While some items were absent, the scene did not reflect a thorough stripping of valuables. In many robbery-related disappearances, the interior of a vehicle is ransacked, drawers opened, compartments emptied, electronics removed in haste. Here, the disorder was minimal. That inconsistency forced investigators to reconsider motive. If robbery had been the primary driver, it appeared unusually incomplete. Another theory centered on opportunistic violence. This version of events suggested that the McCanns encountered someone already operating in or near the area, perhaps a transient individual, someone familiar with rural routes, or someone with knowledge of remote terrain. In this scenario, the encounter was not pre-planned but incidental, escalating quickly into control, abduction, and removal from the scene. This idea gained traction because of the geography. Remote stretches of Alberta highways and forest edges can create pockets of isolation where chance encounters become dangerous precisely because there are no witnesses. However, investigators struggled to identify any consistent presence of individuals in the area at the relevant time. No confirmed sightings of suspicious behavior emerged from nearby travelers or residents that could be directly linked to the moment of disappearance. As a result, attention began to shift toward individuals with known criminal behavior in similar environments. Investigators compiled lists of persons with histories of theft, violence, or vehicle-related crimes in rural regions. Among these profiles, one category stood out: offenders who had previously targeted travelers or remote properties. This narrowed the field slightly, but not enough to produce a concrete suspect. It was during this phase that Travis Vader entered broader investigative awareness. Vader was not initially the central focus, but rather one name among many in a widening net of inquiry. His background included prior criminal activity, drug-related offenses, and behavior consistent with instability. More importantly, he was known to move through rural areas and had connections that placed him within geographic proximity of the McCann's travel route around the relevant timeframe. However, proximity alone is not evidence. Investigators understood this. In large rural jurisdictions, Countless individuals exist within overlapping geographic circles, without ever intersecting meaningfully with a specific crime. Still, Vader's name persisted in discussions because of behavioral patterns that aligned loosely with opportunistic offending. Yet even as his profile was reviewed, no direct physical evidence linked him to the RV scene. There were no fingerprints recovered at the time that could be conclusively tied to him. No eyewitness account placed him with the McCanns. No recovered property belonging to the couple was found in his possession during the early phases of investigation. As a result, the case remained fundamentally circumstantial. Meanwhile, investigators explored another avenue: whether the McCanns had been targeted in advance. This theory suggested premeditation, possibly involving surveillance or knowledge of their travel plans. It raised uncomfortable questions about how easily someone could track RV travelers. Unlike commercial flights or fixed itineraries, RV travel is fluid. It is shaped by mood, weather, and spontaneous decisions. That unpredictability makes pre-planning difficult, but not impossible if someone were monitoring patterns or waiting for opportunity rather than specific timing. Despite this possibility, no evidence of stalking or tracking behavior emerged. No prior threats were recorded. No suspicious contacts with the family were identified. Their journey appeared routine and private. Investigators also examined the possibility of a staged disappearance, an internal family conflict or voluntary exit. But this theory collapsed quickly under scrutiny. The McCanns had established lives, social connections, and no known indicators of planning to vanish. Financial records showed no preparation for sudden departure. Their personal effects, expectations, and travel plans all contradicted the idea of voluntary disappearance. As each theory was tested, it either weakened or dissolved entirely. What remained was a frustrating core truth: the case resisted simplification. Another investigative direction involved the RV fire damage. Analysts studied whether the fire was an attempt to destroy forensic evidence or merely incidental damage caused during another act. The limited spread of the fire suggested control rather than catastrophe. But control itself did not clarify intent. It could indicate concealment, distraction, or even panic-driven behavior. Some investigators speculated that the fire may have been intended to mislead, creating the impression of an accident or forcing responders to focus on damage rather than disappearance. Others argued it was simply a failed attempt at destruction, interrupted before completion. Without definitive burn patterns or accelerant residue clearly identified at the time, the fire remained ambiguous. As weeks passed, the investigation expanded beyond physical evidence into behavioral reconstruction. Analysts attempted to rebuild a timeline minute by minute, based on the last confirmed sightings of the McCanns. Surveillance footage from earlier points along their route showed nothing abnormal. Witness statements from gas stations and rest stops described a typical elderly couple traveling in an RV, appearing calm and unremarkable. This lack of behavioral deviation was itself significant. In many abduction cases, subtle changes in demeanor or travel patterns provide early indicators of distress. Here, no such indicators existed. The transition from normalcy to disappearance was abrupt and invisible. As pressure mounted, investigative teams revisited the scene repeatedly. Each return was less about finding new physical evidence and more about testing assumptions. Could something have been missed in the initial sweep? Could environmental factors have obscured critical details? Could secondary locations exist where evidence had been moved? Search efforts expanded into surrounding forested areas and secondary roads. Ground teams, canine units, and aerial surveys were deployed. Still, no bodies were recovered. No secondary crime scenes were identified. The absence of remains became one of the most defining and haunting aspects of the case. Without bodies, the investigation remained anchored in inference. And inference, while powerful, is fragile in court settings. Investigators were aware that building a prosecutable case would require more than suspicion. It would require a coherent narrative supported by evidence strong enough to survive defense scrutiny. By this stage, Travis Vader remained a person of interest, but not a confirmed suspect in the formal sense. He represented a possible link, not a conclusion. Investigators continued to examine his movements, associations, and criminal history, but the evidentiary gap remained substantial. What emerged instead of resolution was pattern recognition. The McCann case was beginning to resemble other rural disappearances, where victims vanished without direct trace, leaving behind only abandoned vehicles or partial scenes. These cases often shared similar investigative challenges: delayed discovery, environmental degradation of evidence, and lack of eyewitness continuity. For families of Lyle and Marie McCann, however, these analytical categories meant little. For them, the absence was not theoretical. It was permanent uncertainty. As the investigation moved forward, one truth became increasingly clear to those closest to the case. The McCann disappearance was not going to be solved quickly, and it was not going to yield answers through a single breakthrough moment. Instead, it would require years of accumulation, contradiction, and revision. And even then, certainty might never fully arrive. By the time the McCann investigation reached its critical turning point, the case had already spent years resisting resolution. It had absorbed theories, discarded suspects, and survived repeated cycles of public attention and investigative re-evaluation. What made it endure was not a lack of effort, but a lack of something more fundamental: a clean, direct line between victim and perpetrator that could hold up under legal scrutiny. Then, slowly and unevenly, that began to change. The breakthrough did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It came instead as an accumulation of pressure points, small inconsistencies, revisited evidence, and shifting interpretations of earlier findings. Investigators began to re-examine the case not as a single disappearance, but as a sequence of connected events that might have extended beyond the RV scene itself. The most important shift was psychological rather than physical. Investigators stopped asking only what happened at the RV and began asking who would have the ability to control the entire chain of events from that moment forward. That subtle change in framing narrowed the field of possibility in a way that earlier assumptions had not. Among the individuals already known to investigators, Travis Vader began to emerge more prominently in analytical discussions. His name had circulated in the background for years, but now it began to take on structural importance. Not because he was immediately proven guilty of anything at that stage, but because certain behavioral patterns and circumstantial overlaps began to align more tightly with the reconstructed timeline than any other known individual. What strengthened this focus was the growing recognition that the McCann's disappearance likely involved a transition phase between the RV scene and their ultimate fate. In other words, the RV was not necessarily the final location where control was exerted over them. It may have been the beginning of a broader sequence of movement, concealment, and disposal. Investigators revisited geographic data, mapping areas within driving distance of the RV's last known location. They focused on isolated zones, abandoned properties, and low-traffic regions where a vehicle or individuals could be taken without immediate detection. These environmental reconstructions became essential in narrowing down where secondary activity might have occurred. During this phase, forensic teams also re-examined trace evidence collected from the RV. Advances in forensic analysis allowed previously overlooked or inconclusive material to be reassessed. Some residues and patterns, once considered too degraded or ambiguous, were re-evaluated under updated methodologies. While none of these findings independently solved the case, they contributed to a more refined understanding of what had likely occurred inside and around the vehicle. At the same time, investigators began consolidating witness statements that had originally seemed unrelated. Over time, patterns emerged in how certain individuals described suspicious sightings or unusual behavior in rural areas around the time of the disappearance. None of these accounts provided a definitive identification of suspects, but they helped reinforce the idea that the McCann's disappearance was not an isolated, instantaneous event. It likely unfolded over time and distance. This realization marked a turning point in the investigation's conceptual framework. Instead of treating the case as a single location incident, authorities began treating it as a multi-stage crime sequence. That shift made previously disconnected pieces of evidence more relevant. It was within this evolving framework that investigators re-examined Travis Vader's known movements and history. His criminal background included offenses that demonstrated opportunistic behavior and willingness to engage in unlawful activity when circumstances allowed. Importantly, investigators also considered his presence within broader geographic proximity during the relevant period, though exact timelines remained difficult to establish with precision. The challenge, however, was not simply placing him near the crime in a general sense. It was establishing continuity, showing that he could plausibly connect the RV scene to later points where the McCanns might have been moved or harmed. This required bridging gaps that were not easily supported by physical evidence alone. As investigators worked through this, they encountered one of the most persistent obstacles in the entire case: absence of bodies. Without remains, determining cause of death, timing, and sequence of events becomes significantly more complex. It also weakens the ability to construct definitive forensic narratives. Every inference must be supported by indirect evidence, which is inherently more vulnerable to challenge. Despite this, prosecutors and investigators began building what is known as a circumstantial convergence model. This approach does not rely on a single piece of conclusive evidence, but rather on the accumulation of multiple independent factors that, when combined, point toward a consistent explanation. In the McCann case, these included the abandoned RV, the missing couple, trace inconsistencies, and behavioral analysis of persons of interest. Within this model, Vader's role became more defined, though still not fully solidified in the earliest stages of the breakthrough phase. What investigators emphasized was not just his proximity or background, but the alignment of his profile with the type of offender capable of opportunistic rural crime involving vulnerable victims. Still, investigators remained cautious. They had seen too many cases collapse in court due to over-reliance on pattern interpretation without sufficient direct linkage. The legal threshold for conviction required more than narrative coherence. It required admissible, reliable evidence that could withstand cross-examination. A key development came from the reorganization of earlier investigative materials. Cold case review teams restructured timelines, re-interviewed witnesses, and reanalyzed prior assumptions. In doing so, they identified areas where earlier interpretations may have been influenced by incomplete information or premature conclusions. This process did not immediately produce a smoking gun, but it did refine the focus of the investigation. It reduced ambiguity in certain areas and strengthened confidence in others. For example, it reinforced the conclusion that the McCanns did not voluntarily disappear, and that external intervention was overwhelmingly likely. Another significant aspect of the breakthrough phase involved the psychological reconstruction of offender behavior. Behavioral analysts worked to model how an individual could manage control over both victims and environment without leaving behind direct forensic evidence. This included considering how victims might be moved, how vehicles might be manipulated, and how time delays could affect detection probability. These models helped investigators better understand how a crime could unfold without leaving traditional forensic signatures. It also helped explain why earlier searches had failed to locate the McCanns. If movement had occurred across multiple locations, then the initial RV site represented only one segment of a broader, more complex sequence. As the investigation matured, law enforcement agencies began coordinating more closely across jurisdictions. Information sharing increased, and previously fragmented datasets were consolidated. This improved the clarity of movement patterns and allowed for more refined suspect tracking. At this stage, Travis Vader's involvement became more formally scrutinized within prosecutorial frameworks. However, even as his name became central to discussion, investigators remained aware that the case still depended heavily on circumstantial construction. That meant every element had to be carefully validated and cross-checked. The breakthrough, therefore, was not a single discovery. It was the moment when fragmented uncertainty began to coalesce into a prosecutable theory of events. It was the point where investigators could finally articulate a coherent sequence of what likely happened after the RV was discovered abandoned. But even as confidence in the overall structure of the case increased, there remained a persistent discomfort. The absence of the McCann's bodies continued to cast a long shadow over every conclusion. It meant that even the strongest narrative remained, in part, inferential. And so, the breakthrough in the McCann case was not a moment of closure. It was a moment of direction. It told investigators where to look more clearly, but not yet everything they needed to see. By the time the McCann case reached the courtroom phase, it had already lived a long and complicated life outside of it. Years of investigation, shifting theories, and evolving interpretations had transformed what began as a missing persons report into one of the most closely scrutinized circumstantial homicide cases in Alberta's modern legal history. But courtrooms do not deal in narrative continuity. They deal in admissible proof. And that tension would define everything that followed. The prosecution's challenge was immediately clear. They were attempting to secure convictions in a double homicide case without the most fundamental piece of physical evidence that typically anchors such proceedings: the bodies of the victims. Lyle and Marie McCann had never been recovered. There were no confirmed remains to present to the court, no definitive forensic cause of death, no autopsy reports in the traditional sense. Instead, the case rested on a framework built from inference. The abandoned RV, trace evidence recovered from the scene, digital and witness-based timelines, and the behavioral profile of the accused, Travis Vader. From the prosecution's perspective, the central argument was not that every detail of the crime was known with certainty, but that the totality of evidence formed a coherent and unavoidable conclusion. They argued that the disappearance was not an accident, not a voluntary vanishing, and not a series of unrelated events. It was, they said, a coordinated criminal act that began with the McCanns' last known location and ended with their deaths. The defense, however, approached the case from a fundamentally different angle. Their argument was not that nothing had happened to the McCanns, but that the state had not met the legal threshold required to prove what had happened beyond a reasonable doubt. In their view, the absence of bodies was not a minor gap. It was a structural failure in the prosecution's narrative. Without remains, they argued, the certainty of death itself could not be legally established in a way sufficient to support conviction. This created an unusual dynamic in court. Every piece of evidence was weighed not only for what it showed, but for what it failed to show. The abandoned RV, for example, was central to the prosecution's timeline. It demonstrated that something significant had occurred, but it did not, on its own, demonstrate who was responsible for that something, nor did it definitively establish the moment of death. Witness testimony played a major role in filling those gaps. Individuals who had encountered the McCanns during their journey described them as calm, routine, and unremarkable in behavior. These accounts were used by the prosecution to establish baseline normality before disappearance. The absence of any reported distress or disruption supported the argument that whatever occurred, it happened suddenly and unexpectedly. But the defense countered this by emphasizing the limitations of human observation. They argued that normal behavior is not evidence of safety, and that routine interactions cannot be retroactively interpreted as indicators of impending crime. In their view, the prosecution was converting ordinary travel behavior into retrospective symbolism. One of the most heavily discussed components of the trial was the forensic interpretation of the RV itself. Experts testified about the fire damage observed at the scene and the implications of its limited spread. The prosecution argued that the fire damage suggested an attempt to destroy evidence, even if incomplete. The defense challenged this interpretation, suggesting alternative explanations, such as accidental ignition or unrelated damage that occurred after the abandonment. The court was asked to consider not only what the physical evidence showed, but what it implied. This distinction became one of the most contested aspects of the trial. In circumstantial cases, implication often carries as much weight as direct observation, but it also introduces interpretive risk. Another focal point was the movement analysis derived from phone records, travel routes, and environmental mapping. Prosecutors presented a reconstructed timeline, suggesting that the McCann's journey ended abruptly, and that subsequent movements in the area aligned with the presence of individuals capable of transporting or disposing of victims. Travis Vader's presence within this broader geographic and temporal framework was emphasized as a critical link. However, the defense attacked the reliability of this reconstruction. They pointed out gaps in the data, inconsistencies in witness recollections, and the inherent difficulty of placing any individual with precision in rural environments where surveillance coverage is limited. They argued that proximity does not equal participation, and that the prosecution was effectively building identity from geography. As the trial progressed, the absence of physical remains became increasingly central. The defense repeatedly returned to this point, framing it as the core weakness in the entire case. Without bodies, they argued, there could be no definitive confirmation of death, no established cause, and no direct linkage between the accused and any lethal act. The prosecution responded by emphasizing legal precedent and forensic inference. They argued that the law does not require a body for a homicide conviction, only proof beyond a reasonable doubt that death occurred and that the accused was responsible. They pointed to the totality of circumstances, the disappearance under controlled conditions, the abandoned vehicle, and the lack of any plausible alternative explanation. Expert witnesses were called to interpret behavioral patterns associated with violent offenders. These experts described how opportunistic crimes can unfold in remote areas, particularly when victims are isolated and surveillance is minimal. They explained how control, movement, and concealment can be achieved without leaving extensive forensic traces, especially when time is sufficient and environmental conditions are favorable. Still, the defense maintained that these models were speculative. They argued that behavioral science can suggest possibilities, but cannot replace direct evidence. In their view, the prosecution was asking the jury to accept a narrative constructed from probability rather than certainty. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom atmosphere became increasingly tense. The case had evolved beyond a simple question of guilt or innocence. It had become a test of how far circumstantial evidence could be stretched before it risked losing its legal foundation. The prosecution's closing argument focused on synthesis. They brought together every fragment of evidence into a single narrative arc. A couple traveling normally, a sudden disappearance, an abandoned and partially damaged RV, and the presence of an individual whose movements and history aligned with the crime's opportunity window. They argued that when viewed collectively, the evidence did not merely suggest involvement. It pointed toward it. The defense, in contrast, focused on fragmentation. They took the same pieces of evidence and deliberately separated them, arguing that each component was individually insufficient. An abandoned vehicle is not proof of homicide. Missing persons are not proof of death. Suspicious proximity is not proof of action. In their framing, the case only appeared coherent when viewed through the lens of assumption. When the jury retired to deliberate, the question before them was not simply what likely happened to Lyle and Marie McCann. It was whether the law allowed them to conclude, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Travis Vader was responsible for their deaths. The verdict, when it came, reflected the complexity of that question. The court ultimately found Travis Vader guilty of second-degree murder in relation to the deaths of Lyle and Marie McCann. The decision was based on the conclusion that, despite the absence of bodies, the cumulative evidence supported the finding that the McCanns were deceased and that Vader was responsible for their unlawful killing. But even after the verdict, the case did not settle into simplicity. The legal outcome did not eliminate the unresolved nature of the physical disappearance. It did not recover the bodies. It did not fully reconstruct the final moments of the victims' lives. It did not erase the evidentiary gaps that had defined the investigation from the beginning. Instead, it created a different kind of resolution, one grounded in legal certainty rather than complete factual clarity. For the families, this distinction mattered deeply. A conviction provided recognition of harm, but not closure in the traditional sense. The absence of remains meant that mourning could not follow its usual path. There was no gravesite, no physical point of remembrance, no final confirmation of where the McCanns were laid to rest. In the broader legal system, however, the case became a reference point. It demonstrated both the strength and limitations of circumstantial prosecution. It showed that justice could be achieved without physical recovery of victims, but also highlighted the emotional and investigative costs of doing so. And as the courtroom emptied and the legal phase concluded, one truth remained unchanged from the beginning of the case. The McCanns had vanished from a world that still could not fully explain how, or recover them from where they had gone. Long after the verdict faded from headlines, the McCann case continued to linger in the public consciousness like an unfinished sentence. Courtrooms had spoken, appeals had been debated, and legal standards had been argued line by line, but the story itself never fully closed. Because at its core, this was not just a case about guilt or innocence. It was a case defined by absence. The absence of Lyle McCann. The absence of Marie McCann. The absence of a body. The absence of final answers that could settle the human need for certainty. In most homicide cases, the discovery of remains marks a brutal but clarifying moment. It transforms uncertainty into grief with a shape. Families are able to perform rituals of closure, however painful. Burial, remembrance, and physical mourning become possible. But in the McCann case, none of those anchors existed. The legal system had reached a conclusion, but the physical world had not provided resolution. For the families left behind, this created a grief that felt suspended in time. There was a conviction, yes. There was a named offender held responsible by the court. But there was no grave, no confirmed final resting place, no single moment where the search for what happened could transition into this is where they are. That kind of ambiguity changes how grief behaves. It does not settle. It loops back on itself. Even years after the trial, family members continued to revisit every known detail of the timeline, searching for something that might have been missed, something that could restore a sense of completeness. They examined maps of the region, retraced the RV route, and tried to reconstruct the final hours of Lyle and Marie's journey, not as investigators, but as people trying to locate a missing ending. But every reconstruction always reached the same point: the disappearance. After that moment, there was only inference. The legal system, for its part, moved on more decisively. Appeals were processed. Judicial reasoning was reviewed. Standards of evidence were debated in academic and professional circles. The case became a reference point in discussions about circumstantial homicide prosecutions in Canada, particularly those involving missing remains. Some legal scholars viewed the McCann case as an example of the system functioning under difficult constraints. They pointed to the conviction as evidence that modern courts are capable of reaching conclusions, even when traditional forensic anchors are missing. In their view, the law had adapted to the realities of crimes that do not always leave behind complete physical narratives. Others were more cautious. They argued that the case highlighted a dangerous threshold problem: how far inference can be extended before it risks replacing certainty with interpretive confidence. They did not necessarily dispute the verdict itself, but they raised concerns about how such cases might influence future prosecutions where evidence is similarly incomplete. In academic discussions, the McCann case began to appear alongside other so-called no-body homicide cases, becoming part of a broader category of legal study. These cases force courts to answer uncomfortable questions. Can death be proven without a body? Can intent be established without direct forensic linkage? And perhaps most importantly, how does a justice system balance the need to convict the guilty with the obligation to protect against wrongful conviction? Beyond legal theory, the case also had a quieter but deeply human afterlife in the communities connected to it. In rural Alberta, where the disappearance had occurred, people continued to talk about it in passing, often years later, in tones that mixed unease with resignation. It became one of those stories that people reference when discussing travel safety, isolation, or the unpredictability of remote environments. The RV, once a symbol of leisure and independence, took on a different meaning in the public imagination after the case. It became a reminder of vulnerability in places that appear peaceful. Open roads, forested highways, and empty rest stops were no longer just scenic features. They were also spaces where isolation could become absolute. For law enforcement, the case also served as a long-term lesson in investigative persistence. Even though the trial had concluded, agencies continued to review aspects of the file in the years that followed. Advances in forensic technology, changes in data analysis, and evolving investigative frameworks all created the possibility that old evidence might one day be reinterpreted in new ways. Yet despite this ongoing interest, the central physical mystery remained unchanged. No remains were ever recovered. No definitive final scene was ever reconstructed. The last moments of Lyle and Marie McCann's lives remained, in a very literal sense, unobserved. And so the case exists in two parallel forms. In one, it is legally resolved. A court has determined responsibility, and a conviction stands as the formal conclusion of the state's inquiry. In the other, it remains incomplete. A couple disappeared during a routine journey and never returned. The physical truth of what happened to them remains beyond direct confirmation. That duality is what keeps the case alive in public memory. Humans are not only interested in outcomes, they are also drawn to completeness. When a story ends without fully explaining itself, it resists being forgotten. Over time, the McCann case also became a reference point in discussions about the emotional cost of missing persons investigations. Unlike cases where remains are found and justice and mourning can proceed in parallel, missing body cases force families to live in a state where both processes are disrupted. There is justice, but no physical certainty. There is closure in law, but not in experience. This creates a kind of psychological echo that does not resolve easily. Each anniversary of the disappearance reactivates the same unanswered questions. Each media mention reopens the same mental pathways. Even when attention fades publicly, privately it often continues. For investigators who worked the case, the aftermath was also reflective. Many such professionals describe cases like this as defining moments, not because of what was solved, but because of what could not be physically confirmed. They learned to operate within ambiguity, to build conclusions that are legally defensible even when the narrative remains incomplete. Some of them still revisit the case file years later, not because they expect new breakthroughs, but because cases like this rarely leave an investigator's mind completely. The absence of resolution in the physical sense creates a kind of professional residue that persists long after closure is declared. In broader public discourse, the McCann case is often discussed alongside questions about how justice should function when the evidence is inherently incomplete. Should courts require physical proof of death in all homicide cases? Or should they accept that in some environments, particularly remote or isolated ones, crimes can erase their own physical traces? There is no single consensus answer. The McCann case does not provide one. Instead, it stands as an example of how modern justice systems navigate uncertainty, sometimes successfully, sometimes contentiously, but always imperfectly. And at the center of it all remains the image that began the entire investigation. A couple on a journey, traveling through open roads, entering a vast landscape of forests and distance, and then simply vanishing from the visible world. Not dramatically, not publicly, but quietly into absence. Years later, that absence is still the most powerful detail of all. Time does not close cases like this. It only moves them further away from the moment, when everything still felt solvable. Years after the McCann investigation faded from active headlines, the file did not disappear, it settled. It became part of a quieter category of cases kept alive not by urgency, but by permanence. The kind of case that sits in archives, occasionally reopened, occasionally re-examined, but never truly finished in the emotional sense. Because even with a conviction on record, the core reality of the McCann case never changed. Lyle and Marie McCann were never found. That single fact continues to shape everything that came after. In the years following the trial, the landscape of missing persons investigations in Canada gradually evolved. New technologies emerged, improved geographic mapping, refined forensic databases, better cross-jurisdictional coordination. Each advancement brought hope that older cases might finally yield answers. But for the McCanns, none of these developments produced a breakthrough. No remains were ever recovered. No undisputed trace evidence ever surfaced that could anchor their final location. The physical world remained silent. That silence became its own kind of testimony. For those closest to the case, the passage of time created a complex emotional terrain. Grief, in cases with no physical resolution, does not follow a linear path. It does not progress cleanly from shock to acceptance. Instead, it cycles, returning again and again to the same unresolved point. What happened after the RV was abandoned? That question remains the central gravity of the entire investigation. Even with legal closure, the human mind resists fragmentation. It wants continuity. It wants sequence. It wants a final image that connects the last known moment to the confirmed outcome. In the McCann case, that connection was never fully established in the physical record. The law provided an answer, but the landscape did not. And so imagination fills the gap, not as speculation, but as a form of cognitive necessity. Investigators who work the case often describe a similar psychological residue. Long after retirement or reassignment, certain cases remain active in memory, not because they are unsolved in court, but because they are unresolved in narrative form. The McCann case belongs to that category. They remember the RV. They remember the terrain. They remember the difficulty of reconstructing movement across vast rural distances where surveillance is sparse and time gaps are large. They remember how every piece of evidence required careful interpretation, because nothing spoke clearly on its own. But what they remember most is absence. Absence of bodies. Absence of definitive endpoints. Absence of closure that feels complete rather than procedural. In public discourse, the McCann case eventually became symbolic in a broader sense. It was cited in discussions about the limits of circumstantial evidence, the ethics of conviction without physical recovery, and the emotional consequences of missing person homicides. It appeared in legal commentary, training materials, and discussions among investigative professionals as an example of both capability and limitation. It demonstrated that justice systems can, under certain conditions, reach conclusions without traditional forensic anchors. But it also demonstrated that such conclusions do not necessarily resolve the human dimension of a case, because law and lived experience do not always conclude at the same time. For the public, the case slowly transitioned from breaking news to memory, and then from memory to reference point. It became one of those stories that resurfaces occasionally in documentaries, podcasts, or retrospective analyses of unresolved disappearances. Each retelling adds interpretation, but none can add what is missing: the physical truth of what happened to Lyle and Marie McCann. That missing piece is what continues to define the case long after its legal resolution. There is also a broader psychological pattern at work in how such cases are remembered. When a disappearance occurs in an open environment, on roads, in rural areas, in spaces that feel both accessible and unmonitored, it disrupts the assumption that visibility equals safety. The McCann case reinforced that disruption. It reminded the public that vast, open spaces can also be sites of total disappearance. Unlike crimes that occur in confined, traceable environments, cases like this resist reconstruction. The landscape itself becomes part of the ambiguity. Distances are large. Witness coverage is sparse. Environmental conditions erase traces quickly. Time does not preserve evidence, it disperses it. This is why cases like the McCanns remain so difficult to emotionally resolve. The absence is not just investigative, it is environmental. Over time, even the language used to describe the case shifted. Early reporting focused on urgency, missing couple, search underway, possible foul play. Later discussions focused on investigation, prosecution, and conviction. Eventually, the language softened into reflection. Unresolved disappearance, no remains recovered, case used as legal precedent. Each stage of language reflects a different relationship to certainty. But none of them restore what is missing. In quiet moments, those connected to the case sometimes return to the same thought, not as investigators or analysts, but as people trying to make sense of absence itself. What does it mean for a story to end without a final scene? What does it mean for justice to be declared without physical confirmation? And what does it mean for a couple to simply disappear from the known world and never reappear in any recoverable form? These are not legal questions. They are human ones, and they remain unanswered. The McCann case also leaves behind a subtle but lasting impression on how society understands risk in movement and travel. RV journeys, road trips, and remote exploration are still widely seen as safe and normal activities. But cases like this introduce a quiet awareness that isolation changes the equation. Distance from others is freedom, but it is also vulnerability. This duality is part of the case's enduring impact. Even now, years later, the McCann disappearance is not remembered for spectacle. It is remembered for its structure, a beginning that looked ordinary, a middle defined by uncertainty, and an ending that never fully arrived in the physical sense. That structure is what gives the case its lingering weight. Because unresolved cases do not stay in the past in the same way resolved ones do. They remain suspended, neither active nor complete. They exist in a kind of narrative limbo where every new retelling reopens the same central absence. Lyle McCann and Marie McCann were last seen alive on a journey that should have ended in routine return. Instead, their path ended in disappearance, and their disappearance ended in a legal conclusion that still leaves the physical world unanswered. And so the final echo of the case is not a revelation, or a confession, or a recovered truth. It is silence. A silence that stretches across years, across investigations, across courtrooms, and across memory itself. A silence shaped by the absence of two people who left one day and never came back, and a world that still cannot fully explain how, or where, or why. Even after a case moves through courtrooms and reaches a formal legal conclusion, it does not stop evolving in meaning. The McCann case is a clear example of this. The disappearance of Lyle and Marie McCann, followed by the conviction of Travis Vader, created a structure that appears complete on paper, yet remains emotionally and evidentially unfinished in the real world. What remains after the verdict is not resolution in the traditional sense, but a layered aftermath, legal certainty existing alongside physical absence. In the years following the conviction, one of the most persistent realities was the continued absence of the victim's remains. Despite extensive search efforts during the investigation and after, no confirmed trace of Lyle or Marie McCann was ever recovered. This fact alone ensures that the case remains psychologically open, even if legally closed. For investigators, this absence is both familiar and frustrating. Missing person homicides without bodies represent one of the most challenging categories of criminal investigation. They require the court to accept that death can be established through circumstantial evidence, patterns of behavior, and elimination of alternative explanations. In the McCann case, the prosecution's argument succeeded in persuading the court that the totality of circumstances met that threshold. The abandoned RV, the location of evidence, and the contextual movements of the accused were interpreted as sufficient to support the conclusion of homicide. The legal system ultimately accepted that explanation. However, acceptance in law does not erase investigative limitations. The absence of remains means that several questions will likely never be answered with scientific certainty. There is no autopsy confirmation of cause of death. There is no forensic reconstruction of final moments. There is no physical timeline of what occurred after the couple was last accounted for. Instead, investigators are left with inference-based reconstruction, which is inherently probabilistic rather than absolute. This distinction is central to understanding why cases like this remain discussed long after trials conclude. The justice system operates on standards of proof, not completeness of narrative. A conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but it does not require every factual gap to be filled. That gap between legal sufficiency and narrative completeness is where public uncertainty often lives. In the McCann case, the evidentiary foundation was built from multiple strands that, when combined, formed a coherent theory accepted by the court. Yet each strand, when examined individually, still contains degrees of ambiguity. That is the nature of circumstantial homicide cases. They rely on convergence rather than singular definitive proof. This is why such cases often become reference points in legal education and investigative training. They illustrate how multiple partial indicators can collectively meet the threshold of proof, even when no single piece of evidence is conclusive on its own. But they also raise enduring questions about how certainty is constructed. Another key aspect of the aftermath is how the case influenced public perception of rural travel safety. The McCanns were on a recreational journey, traveling through remote areas of Alberta in an RV. Their disappearance underscored how vast rural landscapes can complicate both prevention and investigation of crime. Unlike urban environments, where surveillance, witnesses, and digital tracking are often abundant, rural regions present investigative scarcity. Distances are large, populations are sparse, and environmental conditions can quickly erase physical traces. In such settings, even significant events may leave limited recoverable evidence. This environmental reality played a critical role in both the difficulty of the investigation and the persistence of unanswered questions. For families affected by missing persons cases, this creates a unique form of grief that is not anchored in physical confirmation. Without remains, mourning lacks a fixed point. There is no grave, no verified location of death, no final physical marker that transitions uncertainty into acceptance. Instead, families are left in a prolonged state of informational limbo, where legal outcomes and emotional reality do not fully align. Even when a conviction is secured, that imbalance remains. Over time, cases like McCann's often enter a different phase of existence, the archival phase. They become part of legal records, media retrospectives, and analytical discussions about investigative methodology. They are revisited not for immediate resolution, but for interpretation. In that context, the McCann case is frequently discussed in relation to the broader category of no-body homicide prosecutions. These cases are legally significant because they test the boundaries of evidentiary sufficiency. Courts must determine whether indirect evidence can reliably establish three core elements: that a death occurred, that it was unlawful, and that the accused was responsible. In McCann, the court ultimately affirmed that these standards were met. But the case continues to be cited in discussions about how such determinations are reached and how they should be evaluated in future cases. One of the enduring lessons of the case is the importance of evidentiary convergence. No single piece of evidence was likely decisive on its own. Instead, it was the combination of circumstances, the disappearance under controlled conditions, the abandonment of the RV, and the contextual linkages to the accused, that formed the foundation of the prosecution's argument. This type of evidentiary structure is both powerful and delicate. It allows courts to address crimes where physical evidence is limited, but it also requires careful judicial scrutiny to ensure that inference does not replace proof. For law enforcement, the case also highlights the importance of early-stage search coordination in missing persons investigations. The initial hours and days following disappearance are often critical, particularly in environments where physical evidence may degrade or disappear quickly. Once environmental degradation occurs, reconstructing events becomes exponentially more difficult. In the McCann case, the passage of time before key investigative conclusions were reached contributed to the complexity of the evidentiary landscape. Despite the conviction, the absence of recovered remains continues to define the case's public identity. It is this absence that ensures the story remains open in collective memory. People tend to remember not only what is known, but what is missing. And in this case, what is missing is central. The final image that persists is not one of courtroom resolution, but of disappearance. An RV on a journey, a couple traveling through open terrain, and then silence. That silence is not just investigative. It is existential. It represents the point at which observation ends and uncertainty begins. Years later, the McCann case continues to be referenced in discussions about how justice systems navigate incomplete realities. It stands as an example of how legal systems can reach conclusions without full physical confirmation, but also as a reminder that legal closure does not always translate into narrative closure. In the end, what remains is a dual truth. One truth exists in the courtroom: a conviction, a legal determination of responsibility, and a formal conclusion under law. The other truth exists outside it: two individuals who vanished during a routine journey and were never physically recovered. These two truths coexist without fully merging, and that unresolved space between them is where the case continues to live, not as an active investigation, but as an enduring question about absence, certainty, and the limits of what can ever truly be known. In the years after the McCann conviction, the case gradually shifted from an active legal matter into something more complex. A reference point in the ongoing conversation about how justice is defined when physical truth cannot be fully recovered. The disappearance of Lyle and Marie McCann remained unchanged, but the way people interpreted that disappearance continued to evolve. What makes this case persist is not only what was proven in court, but what was never physically found. No remains, no definitive scene reconstruction, no final, observable moment that can be pointed to and said with certainty, this is where life ended. Instead, there is only a constructed conclusion, built from indirect evidence and contextual interpretation. That distinction is where the McCann case continues to sit uncomfortably in public memory. From a legal standpoint, the conviction of Travis Vader established responsibility within the framework of Canadian criminal law. The court accepted that the cumulative evidence met the threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That threshold is deliberately high, designed to prevent wrongful conviction, while still allowing the justice system to function in cases where direct evidence is unavailable. But the McCann case also exposes the tension inside that standard, because beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all uncertainty. It means beyond reasonable doubt within a legal framework that accepts inference as part of its structure. That is a subtle but important distinction. In cases with bodies, uncertainty is often anchored by forensic confirmation. Cause of death can be determined. Time of death can be estimated. Physical trauma can be documented. The narrative of the crime is grounded in material evidence. In cases like McCann, those anchors are absent. The narrative must be built from external indicators, movement patterns, abandoned property, environmental context, and behavioral inference. Each piece is suggestive rather than definitive. The strength of the case lies in how convincingly those pieces fit together. But fitting together is not the same as being seen directly. That is why the McCann case continues to be examined in legal and investigative discussions. It is often used as an example of how modern justice systems adapt to evidentiary scarcity, particularly in rural or isolated environments where physical evidence can be lost, destroyed, or never discovered. In practical terms, law enforcement agencies learn from cases like this in several ways. One is the importance of rapid containment in missing persons investigations. Another is the need for coordinated multi-jurisdictional response when a disappearance spans large geographic areas. Another is the value of preserving and re-examining circumstantial evidence as forensic technologies evolve. But even with these lessons, the core limitation remains unchanged. If something is never recovered, it cannot be directly examined. That limitation shapes everything that follows. For families, the absence of physical remains creates a type of grief that does not resolve through traditional closure mechanisms. There is no burial, no gravesite, no definitive physical acknowledgement of loss. Even when the law declares a person deceased, the lived experience of that declaration can feel incomplete without material confirmation. This creates a long-term emotional condition, often described in missing persons literature as ambiguous loss. A state where the mind understands an outcome legally or logically, but cannot fully integrate it emotionally because the physical reality remains unresolved. In the McCann case, that ambiguity is permanent. The couple disappeared in a specific place and time, but the final sequence of events remains unobserved. That lack of observation means the human mind continues to return to the gap, attempting to reconstruct what cannot be seen. From a public perspective, this gap is part of what keeps the case alive. People are drawn not only to solved crimes, but to incomplete ones, especially those where the incompleteness is structural rather than temporary. The McCann case does not feel unfinished because it is under investigation. It feels unfinished because a fundamental piece of physical reality is missing. Over time, media coverage and public discussion of the case shifted toward reflection rather than breaking developments. Documentaries, articles, and retrospective analyses began to frame it within broader themes. The reliability of circumstantial evidence, the psychology of disappearance cases, and the boundaries of legal certainty. In these discussions, the case is often not treated as an isolated event, but as part of a category of cases that challenge traditional assumptions about how crimes are proven. One recurring theme is the relationship between visibility and truth. In many criminal cases, truth is established through what can be seen, measured, and physically verified. But in disappearance cases, truth must often be constructed without direct visibility. It becomes an inference about absence rather than an observation of presence. That inversion is what makes these cases so difficult to resolve psychologically. Even within the justice system, there is recognition that such cases occupy a unique space. They are neither fully evidentiary nor fully speculative. They exist in a hybrid zone where legal reasoning must compensate for physical absence. The McCann case is frequently cited in discussions about how far that compensation can extend. Critics of no-body convictions often argue that they increase reliance on interpretive frameworks that may be vulnerable to error. Supporters argue that failing to prosecute such cases would create an unacceptable gap in justice, effectively allowing certain types of crime to evade accountability simply by eliminating physical evidence. The McCann conviction sits within this debate as a real-world example of how courts navigate that tension. But beyond legal and academic analysis, the case also has a quieter legacy. It changes how people think about disappearance. It reinforces the idea that absence is not neutral. When a person vanishes under suspicious circumstances, absence itself becomes evidence that must be interpreted, not simply acknowledged. At the same time, it also reinforces the limits of interpretation. Even strong circumstantial cases cannot restore what is physically missing. They can only provide a structured conclusion within the boundaries of law. That duality, certainty in one system, absence in another, is what defines the McCann case long after its courtroom phase ended. In the end, what remains is not a narrative that fully resolves, but a structure that continues to hold two realities at once. One reality is legal, a conviction based on cumulative evidence accepted by the court. The other is physical, two people who disappeared and were never recovered. Neither reality cancels the other. They coexist, side by side, without fully merging into a single, complete story. And that is why the McCann case continues to be discussed, studied, and remembered. Not because it is still unfolding, but because it never fully closes the gap between what is proven and what is known. Every long investigation leaves behind two kinds of evidence. The first is physical: objects, traces, data points, timelines, forensic materials. The second is something less tangible, but just as powerful: absence shaped into meaning. In the McCann case, it is the second category that continues to define everything. Lyle and Marie McCann did not simply go missing in a logistical sense. They disappeared into a gap in the evidentiary record that no later development has been able to fully close. Their RV was found, damaged and abandoned, but the bodies of the couple were never recovered. That single fact remains the defining feature of the entire case. Even after conviction, the absence did not change. And absence, when it persists long enough, begins to behave like evidence itself, interpreted, revisited, and reweighted over time. In criminal investigations, absence is usually temporary. A missing object is found. A missing person is located. A gap in information is filled by new data. But in this case, the absence hardened into permanence. It stopped being a stage in the investigation and became its final condition. That is why the McCann case continues to be discussed in both legal and investigative circles. It forces a confrontation with a difficult reality. Sometimes the most important evidence is what cannot be recovered. From the perspective of law enforcement methodology, cases like this are studied for what they reveal about investigative limits. Rural geography played a critical role in shaping the McCann investigation. Large, sparsely populated areas create conditions where movement is difficult to track and physical evidence is easily lost to environmental factors. Wind, wildlife activity, weather patterns, and time itself can all erase traces that would otherwise be crucial in reconstructing events. In such environments, even a well-resourced investigation faces structural limitations. This is not a failure of effort. It is a constraint of environment. As a result, investigators are often forced to rely heavily on circumstantial reconstruction. That reconstruction typically involves piecing together movement patterns, identifying points of last confirmed contact, and analyzing abandoned property for trace evidence. In the McCann case, the RV became the central physical anchor of the investigation. It was the last tangible link to the couple's journey. Everything after that point becomes interpretive. Interpretation, however, introduces variability. Different analysts can examine the same set of facts and emphasize different aspects. One may focus on timing and opportunity. Another may focus on alternative explanations for physical evidence. A third may highlight gaps in witness coverage or surveillance data. This is why such cases often remain debated even after legal resolution. The facts do not change, but the weight assigned to each fact can shift depending on analytical perspective. In court, that shifting weight is stabilized by legal standards. The judge and jury are tasked with evaluating whether the collective evidence meets the threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That threshold is intentionally not absolute certainty. It is a standard designed to balance the risk of wrongful conviction against the need to deliver justice in cases where perfect evidence does not exist. In the McCann case, the court concluded that the threshold had been met. But outside the courtroom, interpretation does not end. Public understanding of the case continues to be shaped by a combination of confirmed facts and unresolved gaps. The confirmed facts include the disappearance, the abandoned RV, and the conviction of Travis Vader. The unresolved gaps include the absence of remains, the lack of a directly observed crime scene involving the victims, and the inability to reconstruct the final sequence of events with physical certainty. That combination creates a psychological tension that is difficult to resolve. Humans tend to seek narrative completeness. We expect stories to end with resolution, even in real life. When they do not, the mind continues to return to the missing portion, attempting to fill it. In cases like this, that missing portion is not minor. It is the core of the event itself. Over time, the McCann case has also become part of a broader conversation about how societies remember unresolved disappearances. Unlike resolved homicide cases, which tend to be anchored by physical sites of memory, such as graves or memorials, disappearance cases lack a fixed point of reference. Memory becomes distributed across media reports, legal documents, personal recollections, and public discussion. This distribution means that no single version of the story becomes final in the public mind. Instead, multiple interpretations coexist. Some focus on the legal outcome and treat the case as resolved. Others focus on the absence of remains and treat it as fundamentally incomplete. Both perspectives are grounded in real aspects of the case. This duality is part of what makes the McCann case persist in discussion long after its active phase ended. There is also a broader philosophical dimension that emerges in cases like this: the relationship between knowledge and evidence. In most structured systems of understanding, knowledge is built from what can be observed. But disappearance cases challenge that assumption by introducing events that are defined precisely by lack of observation. The McCanns were last seen. After that point, their physical trajectory becomes unobservable. Everything that follows is reconstruction. Reconstruction can be strong, coherent, and legally sufficient. But it remains reconstruction. That distinction is not merely academic. It affects how people emotionally process outcomes. A reconstructed ending does not always feel like an ending in the same way a witnessed or physically confirmed one does. This is one reason why such cases remain emotionally active long after legal closure. For investigators, the McCann case also serves as a reminder of the importance of preserving investigative flexibility. Early assumptions in missing persons cases can shape the direction of evidence collection. Once a narrative begins to form, there is always a risk that alternative possibilities may receive less attention over time. Modern investigative practice increasingly emphasizes the need to avoid narrowing too quickly, especially in cases where physical evidence is limited or absent. However, even with improved methodology, the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. If there is nothing left to find, investigation eventually reaches a natural limit. At that point, the system transitions from active search to conclusion based on available information. That transition is where the McCann case ultimately rests. What remains, years later, is not an evolving investigation, but a stabilized set of findings surrounded by enduring uncertainty. The legal system has reached its conclusion. The evidentiary record has been evaluated. The conviction stands as the formal outcome. Yet the physical world has not provided corresponding closure, and so the space where answers should be remains open, not as an active gap waiting to be filled, but as a permanent feature of the case itself. That space is what continues to define the McCann disappearance. Not what is known, but what is still missing. In most criminal cases, evidence narrows the world. It takes a wide field of possibilities and compresses it into a single, explainable sequence of events. But in disappearance cases like the McCanns, evidence does something different. It narrows possibilities while simultaneously expanding uncertainty around what cannot be recovered. That paradox defines the final shape of this case. Even years after the conviction of Travis Vader, the McCann investigation continues to exist in a dual state. Legally concluded, but evidentially incomplete. The court has rendered a judgment, but the physical reality of what happened to Lyle and Marie McCann remains inaccessible. No remains were ever found. No confirmed burial site exists. No physical reconstruction of their final moments can be independently verified through forensic recovery. This absence is not a detail in the case. It is the case. In criminal investigations, absence typically functions as a temporary condition. A missing object is eventually located. A missing person is eventually found alive or confirmed deceased through evidence. But in rare cases, absence becomes permanent, and when it does, it changes how every other piece of information is interpreted. The McCann case is one of those rare situations where absence does not resolve into resolution. Instead, it stabilizes into permanence. From an investigative standpoint, this creates a unique challenge. Physical evidence is the foundation of most forensic reconstruction. It allows investigators to confirm timelines, establish cause of death, and validate or disprove witness statements. Without it, reconstruction relies heavily on indirect inference. In the McCann investigation, the RV served as the last confirmed physical anchor. It marked the final point where the couple's presence could be verified. Everything beyond that point becomes a matter of reconstruction rather than observation. Reconstruction, however, is inherently interpretive. It depends on the quality of available data, but also on how that data is organized and understood. Two analysts can examine the same set of facts and produce similar, but not identical conclusions. Small differences in emphasis can lead to different narrative outcomes. This is why cases built on circumstantial evidence often remain subjects of discussion long after legal resolution. The facts do not change, but the interpretation of those facts can continue to evolve. In court, that interpretive flexibility is constrained by legal standards. The question is not whether absolute certainty exists, but whether the evidence collectively establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard is designed to function, even in imperfect evidentiary conditions. In the McCann case, the court determined that the standard had been met. The conviction of Travis Vader reflects that judicial conclusion. But legal conclusion and factual completeness are not the same thing. Outside the courtroom, the absence of physical remains continues to shape how the case is understood. Without bodies, there is no forensic confirmation of cause of death. Without a recovery site, there is no definitive endpoint to the victim's journey. Without those anchors, the narrative remains structurally open. That openness is what gives the case its lasting psychological weight. Human cognition tends to seek closure. When confronted with incomplete information, the mind naturally attempts to construct a full narrative. It fills gaps, tests hypotheses, and revisits inconsistencies. In most situations, additional information eventually resolves those gaps. But in cases like this, no new information arrives to complete the structure. So the structure remains partially open indefinitely. Over time, this creates a layered form of memory around the case. One layer is factual, the known details established by investigation and court proceedings. Another layer is interpretive, how those facts are connected into a narrative. A third layer is speculative, not in the sense of invention, but in the sense of unresolved possibility. These layers coexist without fully merging. For law enforcement professionals, cases like McCann's often become reference points in training and discussion. They illustrate the limits of physical investigation in environments where geography and time work against evidence preservation. They also highlight the importance of careful distinction between what is known, what is inferred, and what remains unknown. One of the key lessons emphasized in such cases is the importance of early evidence preservation. In missing persons investigations, especially those involving remote travel routes, time is a critical factor. Environmental exposure can quickly degrade or erase evidence that might otherwise be crucial for reconstruction. Once that window closes, investigators must rely on secondary indicators. In the McCann case, those indicators eventually formed the basis of a prosecutable theory. But even a strong theory does not replace physical confirmation. It only organizes what remains into the most coherent explanation available under the circumstances. This distinction is central to understanding why the case continues to generate discussion. Public engagement with the McCann case is shaped not only by its legal outcome, but by its unresolved physical dimension. People are often drawn to cases where a clear conclusion exists alongside an unresolved mystery. That tension creates sustained attention over time. The conviction provides closure in one dimension. The absence of remains prevents closure in another. These two forms of closure do not fully align. As a result, the case continues to exist in two parallel states of interpretation. In one, it is a resolved homicide case with a legal verdict. In the other, it is a missing persons case that has never been physically completed. Neither interpretation cancels the other. Both are factually grounded within their respective frameworks. Another important aspect of the case's aftermath is how it contributes to broader discussions about the nature of proof. In most legal contexts, proof is associated with tangible evidence. But modern justice systems must also account for cases where tangible evidence is incomplete or absent. This creates a conceptual shift in how proof is understood. It becomes less about singular definitive artifacts and more about convergence, how multiple lines of indirect evidence align to support a single conclusion. The McCann case is frequently cited in discussions about this shift. It demonstrates both the potential strength and inherent limitations of convergence-based reasoning. When convergence is strong, it can produce a coherent and persuasive narrative of events. When it is weak, it can leave too many gaps unresolved. In this case, the court found the convergence sufficient for conviction. But the broader public interpretation of that convergence continues to vary. That variation is part of what keeps the case alive in discussion long after its legal phase ended. People return to it not because new facts emerge, but because the relationship between known facts and missing elements remains inherently unstable. And in that instability, the case continues to exist. Not as an open investigation, not as a fully closed story, but as a structured absence, defined as much by what cannot be recovered as by what was proven in court. In the end, the McCann case is not only about what happened to Lyle and Marie McCann. It is also about what happens when a justice system reaches the limits of physical evidence and must decide whether absence itself is enough to define truth. And that question, even after conviction, remains suspended in the space where answers should be.